Welcome back to Horror Stories. Tonight's Scary Stories for Sleep edition is tailor-made for those of you who use our tales as a dark lullaby. We're pleased to be your eerie sleep companion as you drift off to our whispers in the night. Before you close your eyes, we're curious. What's your cursed number, and why does it haunt you? Last week's responses were intriguing. Think you can top them? Share your numerical nightmares in the comments. For the full immersive experience, grab your headphones. As you settle in, remember, our stories might just follow you into your dreams. If you're enjoying our nocturnal narratives, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support ensures you never miss a terrifying bedtime story. Now get comfy and prepare yourself. In the world of our stories, the line between sleep and waking nightmares is frighteningly thin. Sweet dreams if you can manage them. And may your unlucky number stay far from tonight's horrors. Part 1. Whispers across the veil. Some doors once opened can never be closed. Those were the words echoing in my mind as we circled around the table, fingers barely touching the planchette. The evening had started off innocent enough, a much-anticipated reunion of college friends. We gathered at Liz's remote cabin, seeking to relive old memories and laugh about the good times. Liz, always the spiritual one, had brought out her prized possession, a Ouija board. It was something she claimed had been passed down through generations, brimming with stories of ghostly encounters. As the eternal skeptic, I couldn't help but roll my eyes. Spirits, ghosts, all figments of overactive imaginations. But Liz insisted, and being the loyal friend, I agreed to play along. The cabin, dimly lit by flickering candles, created an aura that was both cozy and eerie. Liz positioned the board in the center of an old wooden table as we took our seats. Me on one side, Liz directly across, and Scott to my right, with two other friends completing the circle. Nervous giggles and whispered jests filled the air as Liz closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "Is anyone there?" Liz asked in a soft, almost reverent tone. For a while, nothing happened. I grinned, about to make a sarcastic comment, when I felt it, slight resistance under our fingers. The planchette moved, ever so slowly but deliberately. My heart skipped a beat as we watched it glide across the board. Yes, a collective hush fell over the room. My eyes darted around the table, trying to catch someone in the act, but everyone seemed just as bewildered. Liz's voice wavered slightly as she asked, "Who are we speaking to?" The planchette shifted beneath our fingertips once more, drawing out each letter with deliberate force. A-N-T-O-N. Liz's face blanched. "That was my grandfather's name," she whispered, her voice tight with something that could only be described as fear. The atmosphere grew heavier, the air thick with a tense anticipation. "Anton, are you my grandfather?" Liz questioned, her fingers trembling. The planchette zipped across the board so forcefully it nearly tipped over. No. A chill crept down my spine. Whoever, or whatever, was communicating with us. It wasn't her grandfather. We should have stopped then, but curiosity and fear compelled us to continue. "What do you want?" Scott asked, his voice barely steady. The planchette moved once again, spelling out its chilling message. S-O-U-L-S. Panic set our nerves alight. "We need to stop this," Liz muttered, her voice urgent, trembling. We attempted to close the session, but the planchette wouldn't move to the corner. It was as though an invisible force was holding it down, refusing to let go. After what felt like an eternity, the planchette finally released, and the room plunged into an oppressive silence. We scattered from the table, breaths shaky, hearts pounding. The night didn't end with the session. The spirits, or whatever we had contacted, weren't satisfied. Each of us left with a lingering dread, and in the weeks that followed, that dread only grew. Strange occurrences began to unfold, subtle at first, like shadows flitting at the edge of my vision or whispers that seemed to emanate from empty corners. But soon, the hauntings became undeniable. Objects in my apartment moved on their own. Doors creaked open in the dead of night, and the whispering grew louder, more insistent. One night, as I lay in my bed, teetering on the edge of sleep, I felt it. A cold breath against my ear, followed by a voice that seemed to reverberate within my very soul. Y-O-U-B-E-L-O-N-G-T-T-O-U-S-N-O-W. I sat up with a start, drenched in sweat, heart racing. The room was empty, but I knew then that the spirit had followed me home. Part 2. Whispers Across the Veil. The following week was a blur of restless nights and inexplicable occurrences. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and the whispers became more frequent, more intense. It felt like the spirit was toying with me, savoring my growing fear. One night, as I was sitting in my living room trying to distract myself with some work, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing through my apartment. My heart pounded as I stood up, the shadows on the walls seeming to stretch and warp in the dim light. I clenched my fists, moving cautiously towards the hallway. Suddenly, a picture frame flew off the wall, crashing to the floor. The whispered voices filled the space around me, suffocating in their intensity. Youcannonotescape. I froze, the cold chill of terror rooting me to the spot. It felt like invisible eyes were boring into my very soul. The next day, I received a frantic call from Scott. He was agitated, his voice trembling over the phone. "Marcus, something's happening," he said. "My tools, they're moving on their own. It's like someone's here with me, trying to hurt me." I drove to his workshop, unease growing with each passing mile. As I arrived, I saw the disarray, the tools scattered across the floor, drawers pulled open, evidence of a struggle. Scott looked pale, his eyes wide with fear. "It started small," he explained, rubbing his temples as if the act could erase what he'd witnessed. "First, tools went missing, then they flew off the walls. Yesterday, a wrench came at me, missed by inches." We stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of our mutual torment hanging heavy in the air. I knew then that whatever entity we had contacted wasn't just playing games, it meant to harm us. Back at Liz's cabin, I found her sitting on the porch, her normally bright eyes dulled with exhaustion. "It's Anton," she said as I sat down next to her. "I've been having these dreams, nightmares about him. He wants something from us, some connection to my family's past." I placed a hand on her shoulder, but she flinched away. "We need to figure this out before someone gets seriously hurt." In the following days, we became more paranoid and isolated. The hauntings had driven wedges between us, and trust was becoming scarce. We'd start at every creak of a floorboard, every unexpected chill in the air. Scott and I had arguments that would come out of nowhere, spurred by the unseen force that seemed to take pleasure in our suffering. One particularly dreadful night, I was alone in my apartment, the silence almost deafening. I could feel the malevolent presence growing stronger, the air thick with anticipation. From the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow, dark, void-like, more than just a trick of the light. As I turned to face it, the room seemed to tilt, a dark whisper echoing in my mind. Leave. The command was clear, the threat unmistakable. My breath ragged, I grabbed my coat and keys and fled the apartment. But where to go? The spirits had made it clear there was no escape, no sanctuary from their relentless haunting. Part 3. Whispers Across the Veil. Desperation drove us to consult with a spiritual advisor, someone who could help us confront the spirit tormenting our lives. We met at Liz's cabin one last time, gathered in a small circle with a myriad of candles flickering in the dim room. The advisor, an elderly woman with decades of such encounters under her belt, prepared a small altar, whispering incantations under her breath. "It's important to remember," she said gravely, "we're dealing with a spirit that thrives on fear. Do not give it more power." Liz, pale and visibly shaking, guided us through the ritual. The old woman chanted in a language none of us understood, sprinkling salt and herbs around the room. The air felt as if it were growing thicker, suffocating. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted, and the candles flickered violently. An oppressive darkness fell over us. A low growl echoed, building into a deafening roar. Objects began to fly across the room, and the shadows seemed to swell, merging into a single ominous mass. Liz's voice broke the chaos, strong and resolute. "Anton, we sever this tie. Leave us in peace." The spirit responded, not with words, but with a force so powerful it toppled the table, sending candles rolling. Liz was thrust backward, hitting the wall with a sickening thud. Scott and I rushed to her side, but she waved us back, her eyes filled with an eerie determination. "This is my family's burden to bear," she said, her voice trembling. "I have to end this." With a deep breath, she stepped forward, raising her hand to the shadow. "Leave now." The shadow seemed to hesitate, and for a moment it felt like Liz's sheer will might triumph. But then it struck back with a ferocity that sent us both sprawling, the old woman's chants drowned in a cacophony of supernatural fury. In the chaos, Liz's eyes locked with mine. There was a plea there, a desperate acknowledgement of what she was about to do. She stepped into the center of the room, closing her eyes and chanting quietly. The shadow surged toward her, then froze. She whispered a final word, and suddenly a brilliant light erupted from where she stood, purging the darkness. The shadow warped, shrieked, and finally dissipated into nothingness. The room fell eerily silent, the air noticeably lighter. Liz crumpled to the floor, the energy drained from her body. Scott and I ran to her side, but it was too late. Her eyes fluttered closed, and she let out a final, shuddering breath. She had sacrificed herself to break the spirit's hold, an act of bravery that cost her life. Weeks passed, and though the terror seemed to have abated, the scars it left on us were permanent. Scott and I met occasionally, both haunted by our own lingering fears and guilt. My apartment felt quieter, but no less unsettling. The whispers were gone, but the memory of them remained, a constant reminder of the horror we'd endured. Every night as I lay in bed, I could still hear the faintest echo of that terrible night. Candles flicker in the corner of my eye, and shadows seem a little darker than they should be. The fear never truly left. It just settled deeper inside me, a permanent fixture of my psyche. And sometimes in the dead of night I still hear a faint whisper, almost tender but unbearably chilling, "You belong to us forever." The nightmare continues, subtle but unending. The spirit was cast out, but its mark remains indelible. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. If you've made it this far, the shadows have already begun to close in. Subscribe now to ensure you never miss a terrifying tale. And if you dare, hit the thanks button to buy me a cup of midnight brew. Your support keeps the nightmares flowing. Now, brace yourself for our next story. I've worked countless night shifts, seen everything from petty thieves to raccoons on the cameras. But what stood in that abandoned basement was neither man nor animal, and it saw me. My name's John Miller, and I've been working the night shift at Sentinel Surveillance for about 3 years now. Most nights are peaceful, almost mundane. I sit in a dimly lit control room, sipping bad coffee and staring at a bank of flickering monitors. The feeds come from various office buildings we're contracted to watch over. It's usually quiet, except for the occasional break-in or a stray animal triggering the motion sensors. Last Tuesday, things took a turn for the bizarre. The rain was hammering against the small window of my control room. It was around midnight when one of the cameras inside an old, abandoned office building on the outskirts started flickering. The equipment there was ancient, so I wasn't surprised. Still, protocol required me to investigate. I switched to the affected feed. It showed the basement, a dark, dusty room crammed with old furniture and stacks of boxes. The flickering continued for a few moments before settling. Just as I was about to switch back to my regular sweep, I saw it. A figure, faint but distinct, standing in the far corner of the basement. My heart skipped a beat. Leaning closer to the screen, I squinted, trying to make out any details. The figure was almost blending into the shadows, but it was undoubtedly there. Watching. I thought it could be a trick of the light, maybe a dummy someone had left behind. I decided to record the footage and make a note for the morning shift to check it out. "Hey Mike, come check this out." I called over to my colleague Mike Harris, who was casually scrolling through his phone. Mike sauntered over, squinting at the screen before bursting into laughter. "It's probably just a glitch, man. These old cameras are crap." But something in my gut told me it wasn't just a glitch. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even though I was miles away in a different building. I made a mental note to keep an eye on that camera throughout the night. The next night, the rain was still relentless. The same camera began flickering again, this time around 2 a.m. My heart sank as I switched to the feed, and sure enough, the figure was still there. But this time it was closer to the camera, still shrouded in darkness, yet unmistakably nearer. The shape was humanoid but grotesquely distorted. My blood ran cold. "Mike, I swear it's moving," I whispered as Mike peered over my shoulder once more. Dude, it's just your mind playing tricks on you. Maybe you should get some sleep, Mike said, clearly more amused than concerned. But this was different. I couldn't ignore it. The figure seemed to shift slightly, but the grainy feed made it hard to be sure. I decided to record this new footage and flagged it as urgent for the morning shift. My supervisor was going to love this, I thought sarcastically. As the hours dragged on, I couldn't focus on anything but that basement. Each time I checked, the figure seemed to be in the same spot, unmoving. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. When the end of my shift finally came, I gathered my things and headed home, but the image of that figure lingered in my mind. That eerie, shadowy presence felt like it was burned into my eyes, leaving me uneasy even as I tried to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept checking my phone, looking at the timestamps of the footage I'd recorded, hoping for some rational explanation that never came. On Wednesday night, the rain hadn't let up. By now, it felt like the universe was setting up the perfect atmosphere for a horror movie. Around 2 a.m., I took another look at the feed from the basement camera. The figure was present, as expected, but this time, something new happened. I heard a whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. A whisper. I leaned close to the monitor, holding my breath. The whisper repeated, slightly louder, and I could make out the words. Y-O-U-S-H-O-U-L-D-N-O-T-B-E-E-H-E-R-E. I jerked back in my chair, my heart pounding in my chest. What the hell was that? I double-checked the audio levels, thinking it might be some interference. But the whisper was real, and it was directed at me. I quickly recorded the audio, my hands trembling. When Mike came over, he still managed to treat it like a joke, but I could see a flicker of unease in his eyes, too. You're getting too into this, man. It's probably a prank someone's pulling, Mike said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. That night, as I walked to my car, I felt eyes on me. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the figure from the basement. But there was nothing, just the haunting echo of that whisper lingering in my mind. Saturday. The rain was a constant companion by now, almost comforting in its persistence. Just after 3 a.m., the worst happened. All cameras in the building went black at once. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. This was it. I had to know what was going on. I tried resetting the feeds, checked all the cables. Everything was in order, but the screens remained dark. I could no longer sit there and wait. I had to see it with my own eyes. Sarah, I'm heading to the site. I can't take this anymore, I told my colleague Sarah Johnson, who had been shooting me worried glances all night. John, are you sure that's a good idea? Maybe we should wait until morning, Sarah said, concern etched on her face. But I was resolute. No, I have to know. I'll be careful. The drive to the old office building seemed longer than usual. The rain pounded on my car, making visibility poor. When I finally reached the site, it looked even more menacing in person, shrouded in night and rain. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the darkness. Inside, the air was heavy and damp. The silence was almost suffocating, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. I made my way to the basement, every step echoing loudly. As I descended, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. At the bottom of the stairs, I hesitated. A part of me screamed to turn back, but I pushed on. The room was pitch black, my flashlight barely cutting through the gloom. Shadows loomed everywhere, but in the corner where the figure had stood, there was nothing, just an old, dust-covered chair. I took a tentative step forward, scanning the room. That's when I heard it. The whisper, now clearer and closer. L-E-A-V-E. My heart pounded in my ears. I turned to leave, but something stopped me. The chair moved. Not much, just a slight scrape against the floor, but it was enough. Panic surged through me, and I bolted, nearly tripping up the stairs in my haste. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally managing to start the engine and speed away. Back in my car, I sped down the rain-soaked streets, my mind racing as fast as the engine. The fear gnawed at me, making it hard to focus. I grabbed my phone and dialed Mike, my fingers trembling. Mike, I'm getting out of there. Something is really wrong, I shouted over the noise of the rain. Calm down, man. What happened? Mike's voice was tinged with concern, finally taking me seriously. I couldn't find the words to explain the dread that had taken hold of me in that basement. The whispers, the moving chair, it was all too much. Just listen to me. Don't go back there. It's not safe. All right, we'll figure it out. Just get home safe, Mike replied, sounding more awake and alert than I'd ever heard him during a night shift. When I finally reached my apartment, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. But as I fumbled with my keys, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I had seen and heard things I couldn't rationalize, and the fear was still raw and immediate. I made my way inside, locking the door behind me. I collapsed onto my couch, my body exhausted, but my mind still reeling. I couldn't go back to that job. I knew that much. I drafted my resignation email, each keystroke firm and final. I wasn't just quitting, I was fleeing. By morning, I had submitted the resignation and blocked the company's number. I couldn't deal with any questions. I couldn't bear to recount what I'd experienced. I abandoned the job, hoping to leave the fear and paranoia behind. But it wasn't that simple. Sarah visited me later that day, her brow furrowed with concern. "John, what happened out there?" she asked softly, sitting across from me. I hesitated, unsure if she'd believe me, but I had to tell someone. "There was something in that basement, Sarah. Not just a figure. It whispered to me, told me to leave, and the chair, it moved on its own." Her eyes widened, and she reached out to take my hand. "John, you did the right thing by leaving. We'll figure it out, one step at a time." But even with her reassurance, I couldn't shake the chill that had settled into my bones. Weeks passed. The building was demolished, and a new commercial complex replaced it. Yet sometimes when I drove by, the sense of being watched returned, stronger than ever. One night, as I lay in bed, the rain pattering against the window once more, I heard it again. A faint whisper just on the edge of my consciousness. John. The neighbor's window. Every night, he's there, eyes locked on me from across the alley, his presence a dark stain on the edge of my vision. I've caught glimpses of him, fleeting shadows through the curtains, but now I'm starting to fear he isn't just outside my window. He might be inside my mind. It all started when I moved into my new apartment, a quaint one-bedroom on the third floor of an old building. The neighborhood was quiet and charming, just what I needed after breaking up with my boyfriend and leaving our shared home. My new apartment faced another building that was a mirror image of my own. Small comforts, I thought. I remember the first evening. I was unpacking boxes, the mundane routine giving me a sense of normality. I looked up and saw him. There he was, just standing by his window, staring out into the dimly lit alley. Our eyes met, or at least I think they did. I quickly averted my gaze, feeling an odd chill. It had to be a coincidence. Days passed, and I tried to adapt to my new life. Work was stressful, but that's what marketing jobs are like. I confided in Maggie about the breakup and the move. She laughed at my paranoia when I mentioned the man in the window. "He's probably just lonely," she said casually over coffee. But it didn't stop. Every time I looked out, he was there, like some twisted statue. Night came, and the presence didn't wane. He watched, unblinking, unwavering. Even when I tried to ignore him to focus on my work or binge-watch TV shows, his figure persisted at the edge of my vision. One especially cold night, I decided to shut him out entirely. I pulled the curtains closed, determined to reclaim my peace. But as the hours ticked by, sleep refused to come. Instead, I lay there, wide awake, every creak and groan of the building amplified in the silence. And then I heard it, soft, persistent taps at my window. Tap, tap, tap. Heart pounding, I sat up in bed. Was it the wind? A branch? I approached the window, each step heavier than the last. I hesitated, fingers trembling as I grasped the curtain. In one swift motion, I pulled it aside and immediately regretted it. His face was closer than ever before, distorted by the frost on the glass. Panic surged through me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. The tapping stopped, but the silence was worse. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to hide, to breathe. But all I could do was stand there, frozen in my own apartment. When morning came, exhaustion hit me like a freight train. I barely made it through work, my thoughts consumed by the eerie presence looming across the alley. By the time I returned home, dragging my weary body through the door, I felt a hollow emptiness. The curtains stayed shut, but that sense of being watched never left. A few days later, I decided to meet Maggie for coffee again, hoping a bit of normalcy would calm my frayed nerves. As I sipped my latte, I recounted the previous night's events, the tapping, the face at the window. Maggie's eyes narrowed with concern, but I could tell she was skeptical. "Emma, you're probably just stressed. It's just your mind playing tricks," she insisted. But even as she spoke, I could see the first seeds of doubt in her eyes. I wished it was all in my head. I wished the looming dread would vanish with the sunrise. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That night, the tapping returned, even louder and more insistent. Holding my breath, I pressed my ear to the cold glass, hoping for silence, but bracing for something far worse. The Neighbor's Window, Part 2. As I sipped my latte, I felt a sense of unease gnawing at me. Accusing my mind of playing tricks did not make the feeling of being watched any less real. Maggie's dismissive reassurance didn't have the calming effect I needed. "Emma, you're stressed," she repeated. I nodded, but doubt weighed heavy on my heart. Returning home was a struggle. I steeled myself as I approached my building, reluctant to face another night of terror. The shadows seemed to deepen, the world darkening around me. The sidewalk that led to my apartment felt strangely unfamiliar, each step heavier than the last. That night, sleep was an elusive dream. I tumbled into a restless doze, only to find myself back at my window in a nightmare, staring into pitch-black eyes that bore no recognition or humanity. I woke with a start, heart pounding, sweat dripping down my face. I knew the neighbor would be there, but this time, something broke within me. Desperation mixed with a twisted kind of bravery. I couldn't live like this anymore. I pulled on my coat and left my apartment, my footsteps echoing in the silent hallways. Determined to face my fears, I crossed the alley and climbed the steps to his building. My heart was a drum in my ears as I knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked harder, growing bolder with my frustration. Still nothing. When a maintenance worker happened to pass by, I invented a story about leaving something with a friend who occupied the apartment. He shrugged and unlocked the door for me. I stepped inside, expecting confrontation or, at the very least, answers. What I found was far from it. The apartment was empty, dust-covered, and cold. It looked like no one had lived there for weeks, maybe months. Uneaseti eats in my heart, L like a VIC. My phone buzzed, snapping me out of my daze. Maggie checking in on me. I explained where I was and waited for her arrival, the silence of the apartment pressing in on me. When she finally arrived, she wore a skeptical look. "Emma, this place is deserted. There's no way anyone could have been watching you," she said, trying to sound patient. But I could hear the edge in her voice, the shift from concern to disbelief. "Just look around, Maggie. There has to be something," I pleaded, desperation lacing my voice. We searched the apartment together, turning up nothing. Defeat weighed on me as Maggie led me back to my apartment, suggesting that maybe I talk to a professional about the stress. But as we stepped into my living room, my landlord stood there, an odd look on his face. "Emma," he began cautiously, "I need to tell you something about the man who lived across the alley." I listened, every word hitting harder than the last. The neighbor had died weeks ago, alone in his apartment. The cause was a heart attack, they suspected. WE case, AGO. My world spun. If he was dead, then who or what had I been seeing every night? Maggie's grip on my shoulder tightened, her own doubts starting to surface. As disbelief morphed into terror, I felt a deep-seated fear settle in my bones. The man, or whatever presence haunted me, was beyond explanation, beyond rationality. My only choice was to leave, to hope that distance could sever this twisted connection. But deep down, a grim certainty clutched at me. Moving might change my address, but it wouldn't change the haunting, relentless sense of being watched. The Neighbor's Window, Part 3. The silence of the empty apartment across the alley haunted me. Every creak and whisper of the wind amplified my fears, making them tangible. I couldn't stay in my place any longer. I had to confront whatever this thing was once and for all. One cold, clear night, I resolved to face my fears head-on. I armed myself with a flashlight and a sense of determination I hadn't felt before. I crept down the stairs, crossed the alley, and entered the empty apartment. The air felt heavy, laden with an ominous stillness. The moonlight filtered through the window, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. I stood in the middle of the living room, every hair on my body standing on end. It was then I felt it, a cold, almost paralyzing grip on my shoulder. I spun around, swinging the flashlight, but there was nothing, just an empty room with dusty furniture. My breath came in shallow gasps, my heart a hammer in my chest. "Who are you?" I whispered, the words barely audible in the silence. Fear gnawed at my resolve, but I kept my stance. The presence was there, lingering. It was as if the very air around me was alive, watching my every move. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. The terror was real and palpable, pushing me to the edge of sanity. When I finally stumbled out of the building and into the safety of what felt like normal reality, I knew I couldn't stay. Everything about the place was tainted, haunted by an inexplicable dread. I moved out the next day, leaving behind the echoes of my fear and the unsettling presence I couldn't explain. The new apartment was miles away, in a different neighborhood. Fresh start, I told myself. Fresh start. For a while, things seemed brighter. Sleep returned to me in fits and starts. But that sense of being watched never truly disappeared. I was haunted by memories of that cold grip, the eyes that bore into my soul. Then on a night much like the ones before, I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. Soft, insistent tapping at my window. My heart froze. I turned ever so slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. The window was just a few feet away, the curtain drawn tight, but the sound continued. Tap, tap. It had followed me. Whatever it wasn't confined by distance. My lungs strained as if breathing through a thick fog. Drawing the curtain back slightly, I peered into the night, my vision blurred by fear. There was nothing there, just the empty darkness. But the tapping resumed, louder and more insistent. Wearfarfrfin. The haunting wasn't bound by walls or miles. It was inside me, etched into my every waking moment. The chilling taps and deafening silence served as a brutal reminder that some horrors don't remain locked in the past. They follow, relentless and unyielding, no matter how far you run. Part 1. Whispers Across the Veil. It was supposed to be a weekend of laughter and nostalgia. 5 old friends reuniting at a secluded cabin deep in the woods for our annual retreat. The air was crisp, tinged with the earthy scent of fall leaves, and the isolation promised a break from the relentless grind of city life. As we arrived, Rachel, always the adventurous one, pulled out an unexpected item from her bag, a Ouija board. She had found it at an estate sale, she claimed, grinning ear to ear. The board was old, the letters and numbers faded, and the planchette looked worn from years of use. "We should totally use this tonight," Rachel suggested, her eyes sparkling with mischief. The rest of us chuckled, half-heartedly pretending to be scared, but there was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air. "You're kidding, right?" I smirked, giving her a skeptical look. "Come on, Ethan," she replied, nudging me playfully. "What's the worst that could happen?" I shrugged. "Fine, but don't expect me to take any of this seriously." That evening, as the sky darkened and the fireplace crackled, we gathered around the Ouija board. Rachel lit a few candles, their flickering flames dancing shadows across the walls. The atmosphere turned from cozy to eerie in a heartbeat. "Everybody ready?" Rachel's voice was a blend of excitement and caution. We all placed our fingers on the planchette. "Is there anyone here who wishes to communicate with us?" she asked. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence was thick, only punctuated by the crackling fire. I rolled my eyes, about to make a sarcastic remark, when the planchette suddenly jerked. We all stared at each other, eyes wide, breaths held. "That wasn't funny," Mike muttered, his face paling. "Nobody did anything," Jess whispered, her voice trembling. "Who are you?" Rachel asked, her tone more serious now. The planchette moved again, slowly spelling out a name. Elisa. My heart pounded against my ribs. None of us knew Elisa. "What do you want?" Tony's voice, usually bold, wavered with unease. The planchette moved with newfound urgency. Seekredeon. A cold draft swept through the room, extinguishing one of the candles. We all jumped, nerves stretched thin. "All right, that's enough," I said, trying to sound authoritative, but no one moved. There was a magnetic force keeping our fingers on that planchette, a desperate need to see this through. "How did you die?" Jess asked, her voice barely a whisper. There was a pause, and then the planchette moved again with a jolt. "Betrayal. Shadows seemed to dance more wildly now, the candlelight casting ominous shapes on the walls. I felt an unease I couldn't quite shake. Suddenly, the planchette raced across the board, spelling out a simpler, yet more chilling message. Leave. A sense of dread washed over me. I pulled my fingers back, breaking the circle. "Okay, we're done," I said, my voice firm. Rachel nodded, visibly shaken. She pushed the board away, extinguishing the remaining candles, casting the room into darkness except for the faint glow of the fire. We tried to laugh it off, to dismiss what had just happened as a trick of nerves and imagination. But something had shifted in that room, a breach between our world and something far more sinister. Later that night, I found myself unable to sleep. I tossed and turned, my mind replaying the events over and over. When I finally drifted into a restless slumber, the dreams that came were filled with shadows and whispering voices, leaving me with an unshakable feeling that we had awakened something that should have been left alone. I awoke to the sound of something clattering in the kitchen. My heart raced as I crept out of bed, tiptoeing down the hallway. The cabin was silent, except for my own breathing and the errant creaks of old wood. In the kitchen, a knife lay on the floor, spinning slowly to a stop. I looked around, my mind struggling to find a rational explanation, but there was none. This was only the beginning. Part 2. Whispers across the veil. The following day, the tension was palpable. We tried to go about our routine, breakfast, light chatter, but the unease lingered. Rachel suggested we drive into town to clear our heads and maybe do some research on Lisa and the history of the cabin. Everyone agreed, desperate for a distraction. At the local library and historical society, Jess and I dug through old records and newspapers, piecing together fragments of the past. We found an old newspaper article detailing the tragic death of a young woman named Lisa. She had lived in the area decades ago and died under mysterious circumstances. The article hinted at foul play, but the details were scarce and the case had gone cold. As we read, Jess looked up at me, her eyes wide with realization. "Ethan, what if she's the one trying to reach us? What if she was murdered?" I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the truth settling in. Let's get back and tell the others. When we returned to the cabin, the air was thick with paranoia. Tony and Mike were arguing, voices raised, accusing each other of moving the planchette. Even Rachel seemed unnerved, her usual bravado cracked. "We found an article about Lisa," I said, spreading the old newspaper on the table. "She died young, and it was suspicious. Maybe she's trying to tell us something." The room grew silent. Jess continued. "She mentioned betrayal. What if someone she trusted killed her?" Tony scoffed. "You're saying a ghost is haunting us because she wants us to solve her murder?" Before Jess could answer, the lights flickered, and a cold breeze swept through the room, slamming the front door shut. We all jumped, eyes darting around the cabin. That night, the darkness felt heavier. We decided to stay together in the living room, too scared to separate. I sat by the fireplace, staring into the flames, my mind replaying the events over and over. Sleep was elusive, and when it finally claimed me, my dreams were filled with Lisa's face, her eyes filled with sorrow and rage. The next few days were a blur of strange occurrences and heightened fears. Rachel woke up with scratches on her arm, Jess heard whispering voices in her sleep, and Mike claimed he saw a shadowy figure moving through the woods. We were all on edge, our nerves fraying. Tony, in a bid to regain some semblance of control, decided to confront the spirit directly. One evening, he announced, "We're going to communicate with her again, find out what she wants." "Are you crazy?" I snapped. "Look at what's happening to us." "Do you have a better idea?" Tony shot back. His eyes were wide, desperate. Reluctantly, we gathered around the Ouija board once more. The planchette felt cold under our fingers, almost as if it had been left out in the frost. Rachel inhaled deeply and asked, "Lisa, are you here?" The planchette moved immediately, confirming her presence. We steadied our breaths, anticipation mingled with fear. "Why are you haunting us?" Jess asked, her voice barely audible. The response came quickly. TorevealthetrutH. A chill ran down my spine. Tony leaned forward, his jaw set. What truth? The planchette spelled out a message that made my blood run cold. TONYKNOWS. We all turned to Tony, whose face had gone ashen. What is she talking about? I demanded. Tony stammered. I don't know what she means. Rachel's eyes narrowed. Tony, if you're hiding something, now's the time to come clean. Before Tony could respond, the room plunged into darkness, the temperature dropping suddenly. Panic set in, and we fumbled for flashlights and candles. When the lights flickered back on, we saw it on the wall above the fireplace. The letters were scrawled in what looked like soot or ash. L-I-S-A. The gravity of our situation hit us hard. The spirit was not just trying to communicate. It was manifesting its presence in our world. There was no denying it anymore. Tony had a connection to Lisa, and the spirit wouldn't rest until the truth was unearthed. Desperate to understand, I grabbed Tony by the arm and pulled him aside. You need to tell us what you know. If you don't, this won't stop. Tony's eyes were wild with fear, but he nodded. Okay, I'll tell you everything. Part 3, Whispers Across the Veil. We gathered around the fireplace, the flickering light casting eerie, dancing shadows on our faces. Tony took a deep breath, his voice trembling as he began. When I was younger, he said, I lived in this area. I had a friend, Lisa. She was kind, always helping others. One night, she confided in me about someone she trusted who hurt her. She was scared, didn't know what to do. Tony's eyes filled with regret. I didn't believe her, thought she was being dramatic. A few weeks later, she disappeared. Everyone assumed she ran away, but I always had this nagging feeling that something terrible happened. He paused, looking around at us. I never told anyone because I thought it was my fault, if I had believed her. The room was silent, the weight of Tony's guilt hanging in the air. Jess's eyes softened, but there was no time for comfort. The room grew colder, and the Ouija board began to move on its own. The planchette spelled out a new message with deliberate slowness. T-R-U-T-H. Rachel shivered. We need to help her. But how? I asked, frustration mingling with fear. By acknowledging the truth, Tony said, his voice steadying. We need to perform a ritual to give her peace. She needs to know she wasn't forgotten. Rachel nodded. I remember reading about a ritual that could work. We need personal items, something that belonged to her, and something of Tony's to show repentance. We scrambled to collect what we needed. Tony still had an old bracelet Lisa had given him, a simple charm bracelet. It would have to do. We found a secluded clearing outside the cabin, the moon casting an ethereal glow through the trees. Rachel led the ritual, guided by the knowledge she had gathered. We formed a circle, the items placed in the center. As Rachel chanted softly, the wind picked up, swirling leaves around us. The air vibrated with palpable tension. Lisa, Rachel called out, we acknowledge your pain and the betrayal that led to your death. We offer these items as a sign of our repentance and remembrance. Rest in peace. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a cold gust of wind rushed through the clearing, extinguishing our candles. The temperature plummeted, and a silhouette appeared in the mist, a woman's figure barely visible, her eyes filled with sorrow and longing. Tony, she whispered, her voice echoing through the clearing. I trusted you. Tony's knees buckled, and he fell to the ground. I'm sorry, Lisa. I'm so sorry. The figure reached out, her ghostly hand brushing Tony's cheek. Rest now, she said, her voice softening. The wind stilled, and the figure began to dissipate, her presence fading into the night. We stood there in stunned silence, the realization of what we had witnessed sinking in. The oppressive weight that had hung around us lifted, leaving a profound sense of relief and sorrow. The next morning, we packed up and left the cabin. The events of the past few days etched into our memories. Relationships had shifted, the bonds between us tested and strengthened by the trauma we shared. Back in the city, I tried to resume my life, but things never returned to normal. The encounters with Lisa's spirit left an indelible mark. Nights were the hardest. Shadows in the corners of my vision, whispering voices just beyond hearing. One evening, weeks after we returned, I found an old book in my apartment, one I had no memory of acquiring. I opened it, and there, on the inside cover, were the words, Bewarrettetth. A chill ran down my spine. Despite our efforts, the spirit's message lingered, a constant reminder of the night we had crossed the boundary between our world and the supernatural. I realized then that some truths are never truly put to rest, and the past can haunt us in ways we can never fully understand. Every night, the whispers from the woods grew louder, as if whatever lurked in the shadows was getting bolder, inching closer. And then one night, it called my name. It all started innocuously enough. My name's Ethan, and I live alone in a small house on the outskirts of a quiet town. The kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked and waves at strangers. My work requires long, focused hours, which means I'm often up late at night, a habit that suits me just fine. The serenity of the early hours, the dim light of my desk lamp, and the quiet hum of my laptop create a tranquil atmosphere ideal for productivity. One particular night, with a deadline hovering menacingly close, I decided to take a break and step out onto my porch. The clock above my desk read 2:17 a.m. I filled my lungs with the crisp, cool air, savoring the silence that was only occasionally interrupted by the rustling leaves or a distant bark of a neighborhood dog. But that night, there was a new sound, a whisper so faint it could have been mistaken for the wind, yet it had an unmistakable human quality to it. I told myself it was nothing, just my tired mind playing tricks. After all, 2 a.m. isn't exactly the hour for rational thinking. I shook it off, chuckled at my unease, and went back to my desk. But the feeling of being watched lingered, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. The following nights were worse. The whispers didn't go away. Instead, they grew louder, more defined. It was as if someone or something was getting closer, speaking in hushed tones just beyond the tree line, words tantalizingly out of reach. I couldn't make out what was being said, but the cadence was unmistakably human, an eerie lullaby sung in a language I couldn't understand. "Chloe, it's happening again," I confided over the phone, my voice tinged with the kind of fatigue that doesn't come from lack of sleep alone. Chloe, my younger sister, lived a few towns away and had always been my anchor in turbulent times. "It's probably just the wind, Ethan. You're working too hard. You need to rest," she replied, concern threading her words with a soft, skeptical edge. "Maybe you're right," I conceded, but I didn't believe it. When we hung up, the house felt colder, emptier. I decided to take action. I set up security cameras around the house, the tiny LED lights blinking in silent vigilance. I watched the live feed obsessively, waiting for the whispers to start again. It didn't take long. The second night after installing the cameras, I heard it, clearer, closer than ever before. My heart raced as I switched to the footage from the backyard camera, searching for any sign of intruders. And there it was, a shadow at the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of the porch light. I leaned in closer, squinting at the screen, trying to make sense of the blurry shape. It was tall, unnaturally so, with an elongated outline that sent a shiver down my spine. The figure stood there, motionless, staring directly at the camera, or perhaps at me through it. The darkness made it impossible to see any features, but the intent was clear. It knew I was watching. I called Chloe again the next morning, the fear evident in my shaky voice. "I saw something, Chloe. It's not just in my head. There's someone or something in the woods." "Are you sure? Did you get it on camera?" she asked, her tone shifting from skepticism to concern. "Yes, I've got it on footage. I'm going to call the police," I said, my resolve stiffening in the daylight. That night I sat in my office, the glow of the monitors casting shadows across the room. My eyes flicked between my work and the security feeds, every creak and rustle outside amplified by my heightened senses. The hours dragged on, my heart beating like a war drum in my chest. And then it happened. The whispering started again, but now it was unmistakably closer, more insistent. Gone was the faint murmur from the woods. This was inside the house. I froze, every muscle tensing as I listened. The sound seemed to come from the hallway. I turned slowly, afraid of what I might see. The hallway was dark, save for the faint light spilling out from my office. I reached for the flashlight on my desk, the beam cutting through the darkness. My breath hitched. There, at the far end of the hallway, just beyond the edge of the light, was the figure. Tall, thin, and covered in shadows, it stood perfectly still, exuding a palpable sense of malice. And then, in a voice that sent chills through my very soul, it spoke my name. E-T-H-A-N. What came next is a foggy memory of fear and adrenaline. I stumbled back into my office, slamming the door shut and grappling for my phone. The whispers turned into a cacophony of hushed utterances, like a crowd whispering secrets in a foreign tongue. My hands trembled as I dialed 911, my heart pounding in synchronization with each torturous ring. 911, what's your emergency? The calm voice on the other end felt like a lifeline. There's someone in my house, I gasped, my voice barely above a whisper. The dispatcher assured me help was on the way, but the minutes stretched into eternity. Eventually, the wailing sirens broke through the oppressive stillness. Armed with flashlights and an authoritative presence, the police officers searched every corner of my house. They talked softly among themselves, their faces betraying nothing to me. Detective Williams attached himself to the case after hearing my account. We didn't find anyone, Mr. Matthews. No signs of forced entry, no footprints. Are you sure about what you saw? His voice was firm but tinged with empathy, a professional skepticism that made my skin crawl. I know what I saw, I insisted, my resolve barely masking the tremor in my voice. But the doubt had already begun to seed itself. The days that followed were torturous. Chloe called frequently, her concern palpable even over the phone lines. You need to rest, Ethan. You can't keep going like this, she urged. I wanted to believe her, to chalk it all up to stress and exhaustion, but a cold dread sat heavily in my chest. Chloe, I need to see you. Something feels wrong, I finally admitted one night, the weight of my fear pushing through my pride. She arrived the next day, her presence temporarily piercing through the fog of my terror. Chloe's hugs felt like a lifeline, her laughter a temporary balm to my gnawing paranoia. We spent the day catching up, cooking together, and for a few glorious hours, I almost forgot the shadows that lurked just at the edge of my vision. But as night fell, the familiar dread crept back. Chloe noticed my tension and suggested we watch a movie to distract me. We settled on the couch, a comforting blanket wrapped around us, and for a while, I almost felt normal. Then the whispers started again. It was subtle at first, barely audible over the dialogue on screen. I stiffened, my heart rate spiking. Chloe noticed immediately. What is it? Her eyes scanning the room, trying to detect what had set me on edge. Do you hear that? I whispered, hoping against hope that she would say yes, but Chloe shook her head, her eyebrows knitting in concern. Ethan, I don't hear anything. And just like that, the fragile illusion of peace shattered. I bolted upright, grabbing Chloe's hand and pulling her toward my office. I'll show you. Look at the security footage. We huddled together, my hand trembling as I fast-forwarded through hours of footage. And then we saw it, another shadowy figure, this time lingering closer to the house, near the back door. Chloe gasped, her skepticism wavering. Oh my God, Ethan, what is that? I don't know, I confessed, the words feeling like a lead weight in my mouth. But it's real. Chloe's visit ended with a lingering sense of unease. She promised to call more often, to check in, but had to return to her own life, her own duties. The moment she left, the house felt like a tomb, silent and foreboding. Desperation clawed at me. I pored over the footage again and again, each frame burning itself into my memory. I barely slept, my mind a whirlpool of fear and fatigue. The figure would occasionally disappear, only to reappear in the most unexpected places, always watching. One particularly dark night, as I reviewed the recordings for what felt like the 100th time, the whispers started anew. But it wasn't their usual haunting melody. It was frantic, urgent. The feeling of being watched was heavier, pressing down on me like a physical force. I turned around slowly, my breath hitching in my throat. And there it was, standing at the threshold of my office, its form more defined than ever before, cloaked in shifting shadows. ETHANSTOPRUN and eyeing, the figure rasped, its voice a spectral echo that seemed to reverberate through the very walls around me. Fight or flight kicked in, and I chose flight, hurtling out of my office and into the night. I fumbled with my car keys, my vision blurred by tears and terror. Somehow I managed to unlock the door and tumble inside, my hands shaking as I started the engine and sped off into the dark road, away from the house, away from the figure. But deep down, a gnawing fear told me it was far from over. I drove aimlessly for hours, the whispering echoes still ringing in my ears, refusing to let me go. The specter of the figure loomed large in my mind, a force I couldn't escape no matter how far I drove. When I finally turned back, it was nearly dawn. Exhausted and with no other choice, I returned home, the oppressive silence once again folding around me like a shroud. Sleep was a fleeting luxury, but I managed to collapse into a fitful slumber. I dreamt of endless dark corridors, haunted by the whispering figure at every turn. When I awoke, the sunlight seemed alien, too bright for the horrors I'd been living through. I couldn't take it anymore. If I was going to fight this, I needed to understand it. My father's old study was packed with journals and papers that might hold the key. I tore through them, dust and memories swirling in the air, the scent of old paper a distant echo of my childhood. Then I found it, a crumpled, yellowing letter from my father, written years before his own disappearance. It spoke of an entity, a dark figure that haunted our family, tied to the woods behind our home. He had faced it too and had been driven to the brink of madness. The letter's final words were almost incomprehensible, scrawled in a frenzy. I-F-I-G-U-R-E-W-I-L-L-L-W-A-Y-S-F-I-N-D. The realization crashed over me like a tidal wave. This entity wasn't just a figment of my imagination, it was real, a curse that had haunted my family for generations. My father's fate, my own terror, they were all connected by this malevolent presence. Determination replaced my fear. I would face it, end this once and for all. That night, I prepared myself, every nerve in my body taut with anticipation. The whispers started as expected, growing louder, more insistent. I stood in the middle of my office, facing the dark hallway where it always appeared. "Show yourself," I commanded, my voice betraying a tremor, despite my resolve. The air grew thick, the temperature dropping sharply. The figure materialized at the end of the hallway, its form more defined, more human, and yet horrifyingly otherworldly. Its eyes, if you could call those dark voids eyes, bored into me. "E-T-H-A-N-Y-U-C-N-N-O-D-S-C-A peep," it whispered, the sound a garbled cacophony of voices. A surge of anger welled up in me, mixing with my terror. "What do you want?" I screamed, my voice echoing through the empty house. "Why oh you?" it replied simply, stepping forward, its shadows reaching out like tendrils. A rush of memories flooded my mind. My father's madness, his disappearance, my restless nights filled with whispers. This thing fed on our fear, grew stronger with each generation it tormented. But knowledge was power, and I now understood its true nature. I stepped forward, each motion deliberate. "You can't have me," I declared, my voice steadying. "This ends tonight." The figure paused, as if considering my words. Then the whispers grew deafening, a storm of bluff voices and shadows. I felt the familiar dread rising, but I forced it down, focusing instead on the memories of my father's strength, the determination that had once driven him to confront this horror. The entity lashed out, its tendrils wrapping around me, pulling me into its darkness. Pain lanced through me, every nerve ending alight with agony. I closed my eyes, drawing on every ounce of willpower to resist. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The air grew still, the whispers dying away. I opened my eyes to find the figure had receded, its shadow flickering like a dying flame. It let out a final, bone-chilling scream before dissipating into the darkness from whence it came. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, the weight of the encounter pressing down on me. But I knew deep down that I had won. The house felt lighter, the oppressive air lifting for the first time in weeks. But as I prepared to gather my things, intent on leaving this cursed place forever, a final realization struck me. The figure was not gone, merely biding its time. Its whispers would haunt me wherever I went. But now, I was prepared. I would carry the knowledge of its existence, the strength to resist it, wherever life led me. As a final act of defiance, I stepped out into the early morning light, one last glance at the house that had been both sanctuary and prison. In the rearview mirror of my car, for just a moment, I saw it, the shadowy figure, watching from the edge of the woods. E-T-H-A-N, we dial M-E-E-A-G-I-N. I can still hear the whispers at night, voices of the damned, trapped in an endless cycle of torment. It all started with a single foolish night. The storm outside was relentless, lightning crackling through the night sky and thunder rolling like an angry beast. It was the perfect setting for our adventure, or so we thought. The ancient manor loomed before us, an eerie silhouette against the storm's fury. Its windows were like dead eyes, watching, waiting. We were there to celebrate the end of our college years, a last hurrah before stepping into the adult world. There was me, Thomas, always the skeptic, brushing off ghost stories and superstitions. Sarah, with her wide eyes and insatiable curiosity, was enthralled by anything paranormal. Rachel's sharp wit often masked her own fears, while Mike, the rational thinker, considered it all a silly lark. Together, we decided on the mansion, driven by the thrill of the unknown and the storm that seemed to beckon us inside. The creaky door groaned in protest as we pushed it open, stepping into the decaying grandeur of the entrance hall. Dust particles floated in the air, disturbed by our intrusion. The mansion felt alive in its decay, every creak and groan echoing like a whisper of disapproval. "It's just a house," Mike said, his voice steady, though his eyes betrayed a hint of unease. Sarah spotted the attic door, a rope hanging like a forgotten piece of history. "Let's check up there. Maybe we'll find something interesting," she insisted, her enthusiasm infectious despite the growing tension. We followed her up the rickety stairs, our flashlights casting long, ghostly shadows. The attic was cluttered with the remnants of a bygone era, dusty trunks, broken furniture, and then near the back, an old, forgotten Ouija board. "Let's play," Sarah said, her eyes wide with a mix of excitement and trepidation. I laughed, shaking my head. "You really think this thing works?" "Only one way to find out," Rachel chimed in, though her attempt at bravado didn't quite mask her wariness. We gathered around the board, sitting cross-legged on the dusty attic floor, the storm outside an angry backdrop to our folly. Sarah lit a few candles, their flickering light creating dancing shadows that seemed almost alive. "Who's gonna start?" Mike asked, his doubt evident. "I will," Sarah declared, placing her fingers lightly on the planchette. We followed suit, forming a circle of intertwined fates. She took a deep breath, voice steady but eyes flicking nervously. "Is there anyone here with us?" The planchette moved slowly at first, a hesitant slide across the board. We watched in uncomfortable silence, laughter dying as the atmosphere shifted. "Whose idea was this again?" Rachel muttered, her voice a weak attempt to cut the tension. Then the planchette jerked sharply, spelling out a name. Caroline. I shivered involuntarily. "This is a joke, right? Who's moving it?" No one answered. The silence grew, thick and oppressive, as the planchette continued its erratic dance across the board. It spelled out more words, a series of confusing and deeply personal messages that gnawed at our nerves. DANGER. This is getting too real. We should stop. Mike's voice was shaking now, the calm facade completely shattered. But the planchette didn't stop. It kept spelling out things only we would know. Our deepest fears, our hidden traumas, the darkest corners of our souls. The room grew colder, our breath visible in the flickering candlelight. Sarah's face was pale, her fingers trembling. "What do you want?" she asked the board, her voice barely a whisper. RELEASE. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Was this real? Could there be a spirit trapped, using us to find freedom? The thought was absurd, yet the fear was tangible, clawing at my rational mind. Suddenly, Sarah gasped, looking as if she had been struck. Her eyes rolled back and she collapsed, convulsing violently. We jumped to her side, the board forgotten as panic took over. Sarah, wake up!" I shouted, trying to hold her steady. Her eyes snapped open, wide and terrified, and she spoke with a voice that wasn't her own. "You mustn't leave. The cycle must continue. The whispers, the whispers." The room's temperature plunged. We dragged Sarah away from the board, the air thick with an oppressive, otherworldly presence. The storm outside raged on, but inside, something far more sinister was brewing, binding us in a cycle of horror we were only beginning to understand. Sarah's eyes fluttered as she regained consciousness, but she looked more terrified than ever. "We need to end this," Mike said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. I nodded, moving back to the board with a determination born from terror. "We're saying goodbye now," I declared as firmly as I could. But when we placed our fingers back on the planchette, it wouldn't budge. "Our Father, who art in heaven." Rachel began to pray, but it only seemed to anger the entity. The room grew colder, the air thickening as an unseen presence closed in around us. "It's not going to let us go," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. Desperation clawed at my throat. I grabbed the board, ready to fling it against the wall, but something stopped me. An invisible force held me in place, the whispers louder, more insistent. "END," my mind screamed, but my body wouldn't comply. Then the planchette moved again, faster this time. "RELEASE. Release us," Sarah translated, her voice hollow. "It wants us to say the words." We looked at each other, fear mirrored in every face. But before we could decide, a violent jolt threw us all back. Sarah screamed, clutching her head as the whispers turned into a deafening roar. We scrambled to our feet, dragging Sarah along, our minds set on one goal: escape. The mansion seemed to warp around us, hallways stretching endlessly as if trying to trap us within. "Get to the door," Mike shouted, his voice barely audible over the piercing noise. We stumbled and staggered, the path to the exit twisting in ways that defied logic. Shadows danced along the walls, mocking our every step. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out my thoughts. Finally, we burst through the front door into the cold night air, the storm's fury feeling almost a relief compared to the suffocating presence inside. We didn't stop running until we reached our cars, panting and wide-eyed, too shaken to speak. But the real horror followed us home. That night, and every night after, the whispers invaded our dreams, turning sleep into a torturous ordeal. We saw glimpses of the entity, a shadowy figure with eyes that bore into our souls, murmuring in tongues ancient and dreadful. Rachel started avoiding sleep altogether, her eyes haunted by exhaustion. "If I fall asleep, it wins," she said one day, her voice a broken whisper. Sarah's condition worsened. Her moments of clarity grew rare, her mind a battleground she couldn't escape. She rambled incoherently, eyes unfocused, as if perpetually caught in a nightmare. Mike, always the rational one, tried to research ways to break the curse, but his skepticism gave way to paranoia. He saw shadows where there were none, flinched at every whisper of the wind. And me, I could barely hold it together. The constant presence of the whispers, the never-ending torment, it all took a toll I couldn't measure. The worst part was the helplessness, knowing we had unleashed something we couldn't understand, let alone control. Sleep became a battleground where we fought night after night. I would wake up drenched in sweat, the echoes of the damned still reverberating in my ears. It felt like drowning in a sea of horror, gasping for breaths of sanity that never truly came. We tried to distance ourselves, but it made no difference. The entity had latched onto us, a parasite that fed off our fear. There was no escape, only moments of brief respite before the cycle began anew each night. God help us, we'd unleashed hell, and there was no way to put it back. Years slipped by, each one dragging us further into madness. Sarah remained in a coma, her body a shell devoid of the vibrant spirit she once had. Rachel moved away, attempting to restart her life, but it didn't help. The whispers found her, no matter where she hid. Mike, now a shadow of his former self, grew increasingly obsessed with breaking the curse. He spent his days buried in books and his nights in restless vigil, fending off the phantoms of his mind. And me? I felt an unshakable pullback to that mansion. The whispers morphed into a siren call, each night blending into a ceaseless plea to return. One evening, unable to resist any longer, I found myself driving back to where it all began, my hands gripping the steering wheel like a lifeline. The mansion loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, seemingly untouched by the passage of time. As I approached, an unsettling sense of déjà vu washed over me. I stepped out of the car, the whispers intensifying in my mind. Inside, the air was as cold and oppressive as I remembered. The floorboards creaked under my feet, as if the house itself remembered and resented my return. As I navigated the hallways, I heard voices, young, trembling, eerily familiar. My heart sank. There they were, a new group of intrepid explorers gathered around a fresh Ouija board. Fear and excitement warred on their faces, mirroring our expressions from that fateful night. I watched in horror as they placed their fingers on the planchette. "You need to stop," I called out, my voice trembling with urgency. They looked up, startled and confused. "Who are you?" one of them asked, a young woman with wide, terrified eyes. "I've been through this. You have to leave now." It's not a game. I stumbled towards them, each step feeling like wading through thick sludge. No way, man. You're just trying to scare us, one of the guys scoffed, defiance masking his fear. Before I could argue, the planchette jerked to life. Their faces went pale as they spelled out RELEASE. Realization dawned with a chill that settled deep in my bones. The entity wasn't just tormenting us, it was drawing in new victims to sustain its grip on this world. The cycle was endless, feeding on fear and desperation. "Listen to me," I shouted, desperation edging my voice. "You don't know what you're dealing with. We unleashed something that won't let go. If you stay, you're all doomed." The room grew colder, the shadows lengthening, dancing more wildly. The young woman's eyes widened, and she looked at her friends with mounting terror. "I think he's right. This place, it feels wrong." The others hesitated, torn between pride and survival instincts. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of doomed voices pleading and screaming. "Leave now, before it takes you too," I screamed, my voice raw with panic. They moved, driven by something more primal than logic. They gathered their things, the planchette still vibrating with an unseen force, and rushed towards the exit. I followed, every step syncing with the oppressive beat of the malevolent presence around us. Outside, the storm had calmed, but a weight still hung heavy in the air. They stood by their cars, breaths ragged, eyes wide with the realization of their narrow escape. What was that?" the young woman asked, tears streaking down her face. "A cycle of horror," I said, my voice hollow. "It never ends. Get as far away as you can, and never look back." I turned away, the whispers fading into a distant hum as they drove off. Alone, I faced the mansion, understanding the true horror at last. We weren't the first, nor would we be the last. The entity fed off our fear, perpetuating its cycle of torment through lure of curiosity and hubris. And as I walked back to my car, one final whisper echoed through my mind. D-E-E. But I did leave, speeding away from that hellish place with only one resolution, to warn others, to break the cycle if I could. The whispers may follow, but I would refuse to listen. I owed it to Sarah, to Mike, to Rachel and myself, to whoever came next. I woke up to an eerily quiet house. It was early morning, the first rays of sunlight pushing through the curtains, casting long shadows on the bedroom floor. The bed beside me was neatly made, almost too neatly. Sarah was an early riser, but she never left the bed so immaculate. The silence gnawed at me. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't place it. "Sarah?" I called out, my voice sounding foreign in the heavy stillness. No response. As I made my way downstairs, unease blossomed into full-blown anxiety. The usual hum of the radio playing in the kitchen was absent. There was no aroma of her signature morning coffee wafting through the house. Panic began to set in. This wasn't right. "Sarah, where are you?" I shouted. I searched every room, every corner, opening doors with an urgency that bordered on frenzy. There was no trace of her. The kitchen was spotless, the living room undisturbed, and her favorite book rested on the coffee table, untouched. My heart raced as I ran back upstairs. Our bedroom dresser, once cluttered with Sarah's clothes, was now empty. I yanked open the closet doors, only my clothes hung there. I checked the bathroom. Her toiletries were gone, as if she never existed. I grabbed my phone, frantically dialing her number, only to be met with a cold, automated voice informing me that the number was disconnected. I need proof, something to reassure myself that I'm not losing my mind. I tore through our house, scattering papers, opening drawers, searching for any sign of her. But the more I looked, the more panicked I became. Every photograph, every memento of our life together had disappeared. The picture of us from our wedding day, the framed selfies from our trips, all gone. Desperation drove me to contact our friends and family. I called everyone I could think of, hoping someone remembered her. Each conversation brought further confusion and distress. My parents, who had adored Sarah, expressed blank confusion. "Who's Sarah?" they asked, as if I'd mentioned a complete stranger. "It's Sarah, your daughter-in-law," I insisted. "I'm sorry, son. I don't know what you're talking about." My heart sank. It was as if Sarah had been plucked from existence, leaving me with an overwhelming void filled only with memories. Was I losing my mind? Several exhausting hours later, I found myself in the attic, rummaging through old boxes and dusty keepsakes. I stumbled upon a worn-out journal, mine from several years ago. It was filled with detailed entries of our time together, written in my own hand. Shakily, I sat down and started reading. Met Sarah today at the cafe downtown. She has the brightest smile, I read aloud. Tears welled up as I flipped through the pages. Our first anniversary. She loved the necklace I got her. Every entry confirmed what I already knew. Sarah was real. She had to be. Yet, some inexplicable force had erased her from the fabric of this world. The next logical step was to call our mutual friends. Maybe someone could help me make sense of this. I started with Mike and Lisa, our closest friends who'd known us since college. But their responses mirrored those of my parents. They had no recollection of Sarah. Feeling a mix of frustration and dread, I decided to reach out to Sarah's colleague, Dr. Emily Turner. She might not remember her, but she could at least talk about the work Sarah was doing before she vanished. Maybe there was a clue there. I dialed Emily's number, my hands trembling slightly. She picked up on the second ring. "Hello, Emily speaking." "Emily, it's John Miller, Sarah's husband," I said, my voice wavering. There was a moment of silence before she replied, "I'm sorry, who?" "It's John," I repeated, more insistent this time. "Sarah Miller's husband. You worked together on some research." "I'm afraid I don't know any Sarah Miller," Emily said, her tone puzzled. "No, she talked about you all the time." I was practically shouting now. "You were working on some research together. Please think." "I don't know any Sarah," Emily replied, sounding hesitant now, "but I can tell you about my recent project if you want." Realizing it was futile to push further, I agreed. Maybe understanding Emily's research could provide some clues. As I hung up, it dawned on me just how isolated I had become. No one remembered Sarah. It was as if a piece of my soul had been excised from reality. I was the only keeper of our memories, a custodian of a life that might have existed only in my mind. But the journal entries were real. The words, the emotions, they were too vivid to be a fabrication. I refused to let go, to surrender to the madness that threatened to consume me. With determination and dread, I dug deeper, preparing to dive into the fragmented tapestry of my life, desperately seeking threads that could lead me back to Sarah. I couldn't let go of the memories, even if no one else remembered them. The journal was my lifeline, a tangible connection to Sarah. I took it with me everywhere, hoping it would lead me to some answers. Late one night, after hours of anxious thoughts and restless pacing, I remembered the attic. There were more boxes and keepsakes I hadn't sorted through. Perhaps I had missed something that could prove Sarah existed. I climbed the creaky wooden steps, the air thick with dust and nostalgia. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, filled with forgotten belongings. I moved through them, my hands trembling with both anticipation and fear. There it was, tucked away in a corner, an old box marked memories. I opened it and my breath caught. Photographs, letters, and tiny mementos from our life together spilled out. Among them, a worn-out journal I hadn't seen before. As I flipped through it, my own entries leapt off the pages, bringing Sarah back to life through words. One specific entry stood out. Our first anniversary. She loved the necklace I got her. This was real. These memories were real. They had to be. The next day, clutching the journal like a talisman, I drove to the university where Sarah worked. Dr. Emily Turner agreed to meet me in her office. Maybe I could jog her memory, or at least learn more about the work they were doing together. Emily's office was a cluttered haven of books and research papers. She greeted me with a polite but distant smile, offering me a seat. "John, right?" she said. "You mentioned over the phone that you wanted to talk about our research." "Yes, Sarah, my wife. She talked about you and your work. There's something strange going on, and I think it's connected," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. Emily frowned. "As I told you, I don't know a Sarah, but I can tell you about our recent project on quantum mechanics and parallel universes. Maybe it can shed some light." I nodded, barely able to contain my anxiety. Emily began explaining their theories. Ways travel between alternate realities might be possible. Her words blurred together, my mind racing to connect the dots. This was it. This could explain everything. Then something flickered in the periphery of my vision. I turned quickly, seeing nothing but the ordinary office. but the sensation was unsettlingly familiar, a déjà vu that gnawed at my sanity. As I left Emily's office, my nerves were frayed. Could Sarah have somehow traversed into another reality? Was that why no one remembered her? My thoughts spiraled as I drove home, the weight of the journal heavy in my lap. That night, as I sat alone in the living room, the world around me seemed to shimmer and twist. I stood up, trying to shake off the feeling, but it only intensified. Then, just for a moment, the room changed. It was as if I was seeing two versions of it overlaying each other. And there, just for a split second, I saw her. "Sarah?" I called out, the name a whisper, a plea. But as quickly as it happened, it was gone. The room returned to its mundane reality, leaving me doubting my own eyes. Panic and hope collided within me. Was I seeing glimpses of another reality, one where Sarah still existed? My mind raced, grasping at the fragile threads of reality that seemed to fray before me. Determined not to lose my grip on what remained of my sanity, I decided to drive to our favorite cafe. Maybe there, in a place rich with shared memories, I could find another piece of the puzzle. The cafe was just as I remembered, a cozy corner of normalcy amidst the chaos of my life. I ordered a coffee and sat at our usual table, scanning the room for any sign, any flicker of change. And then, right there, taped to the inside of the window, I saw it, a photograph of Sarah and me, smiling. I approached it with a mix of dread and elation. On the back of the photograph, in Sarah's delicate handwriting, were the words, "Remember me." My heart pounded as I read the message again and again. This was real. It had to be. She was reaching out from somewhere, somewhen. I clung to the photograph, a lifeline in a sea of uncertainty. I had to find her. I had to bring her back. Determined, I decided to dive deeper into her notes, her research, anything that could lead me to Sarah. Whatever it took, I would find her. That night, for the first time in weeks, my dreams weren't filled with dread, but with a spark of hope. The photograph felt like a beacon, guiding me through the thick fog of uncertainty. It was a sign that Sarah was out there, somewhere, maybe even trying to come back to me. I couldn't let this chance slip away. I reached out to Mark, my childhood friend. He had always been the pragmatic one, and I needed his clear-headedness now more than ever. Mark arrived at my house, his skeptical look suggesting he thought I might have finally lost it. But he listened as I recounted the horrors of the past days. "You found a picture of you and Sarah at the cafe? And no one else remembers her?" Mark asked, struggling to hide his doubt. "Yes," I insisted. "And there's more. Sarah was working on something before she disappeared, something to do with parallel universes. I think she might have crossed over." Mark leaned back, crossing his arms. "That's hard to swallow, John. But I've seen weirder things in the military. All right, what do you need me to do?" "Help me get to her lab. I found notes and clues that point there. Maybe we can find more answers," I said. That night, we broke into the old lab where Sarah had conducted her experiments. The air was thick with the scent of chemicals and the hum of dormant machines. Sarah's equipment, meticulously arranged, looked otherworldly in the dim light. I showed Mark Sarah's journal and the photograph. We began combing through the lab, trying to decipher her notes on quantum mechanics and alternate realities. Mark's practical mindset complemented my growing obsession, grounding me as we worked. Hours passed. Just when my hope began to wane, we found it, a handwritten note tucked inside an old science book. It contained a series of mathematical equations and a coded message. "Follow the path. Remember the date, for 4/07/15. The date held significance. It was our anniversary, the same day I read about in my journal. But what did it mean? As we puzzled over the note, I experienced another glitch. The room briefly shimmered, and for an instant I saw Sarah standing by the lab bench, looking at me with sorrowful eyes. "John," she whispered, "find me." I blinked, and she was gone again. Mark saw my dazed expression. "Did you see her?" "Yes," I whispered, voice trembling. "She asked me to find her." Driven by this vision, I worked tirelessly on the equations. We set up the equipment according to the instructions, hoping to replicate whatever Sarah had done. As the machine powered up, the room filled with a soft, resonant hum. We input the date, our anniversary, the one significant number Sarah had left for us. My heart pounded as the machine's hum grew louder, enveloping us in its otherworldly resonance. Mark stood by, ready to pull me back if anything went wrong. Are you sure about this, John? Mark asked, concern etched on his face. I have to be. I need to find her, I replied, stepping closer to the machine. The room began to twist and bend, the machines flickering in and out of focus like a surreal painting. I felt a pull, not physical, but existential, tugging at the very fabric of my being. Sarah, I called out, hoping against hope she could hear me. Then the world snapped. I was standing in the same room, but it was different. The equipment was arranged as if someone had been working just moments ago. And there she was, Sarah, standing by the lab bench, looking at me with wide eyes. John, she whispered, stepping towards me. Sarah, I ran to her, wrapping her in my arms. What happened? Where are we? Why doesn't anyone remember you? We're in another reality, she explained, tears in her eyes. I was working on a way to cross over to study parallel universes, but something went wrong. When I crossed, it erased me from our original world. We can go back, can't we? Together? I asked, desperation in my voice. I think so, but there's a risk. The transition could separate us again, forever. No, we'll do it together. I can't lose you again, I insisted. Together, we worked swiftly, recalibrating the machine to return us to our original reality. The room filled with that same resonant hum, the world beginning to twist and shimmer once more. As the transition began, I held Sarah's hand tightly, afraid to let go. The world snapped again. I found myself back in our home, gasping for breath. Sarah was beside me, her hand still in mine. I turned to her, eyes brimming with tears. Sarah, are you here? Really here? She smiled, squeezing my hand. Yes, John, I'm here. We made it. But as I looked around, something still felt off. A subtle change in the air, a lingering sense of unease. The world outside the window seemed just a shade different. Had we really returned home? Or had we crossed into yet another reality? As we stood together, holding each other tightly, I couldn't shake the feeling that our journey was far from over. John, her voice interjected, slow and deliberate. Imisssedyu. I missed you too, Sarah, I replied, hoping against the creeping dread that this reality would be the one where we truly belonged.
It felt like just another game, an adrenaline-fueled thrill, a harmless dabble in the supernatural. But as the cold candlelight flickered in Jake's basement that stormy evening, the whispers from the Ouija board began to grow louder, promising an unsettling night ahead. 10 years ago, I was just 17, chasing shadows with my friends in Jake Summers' old basement. It was the beginning of summer, and a thunderstorm raged outside, making the night perfect for spooky adventures. Jake, the ringleader of our little group, pulled out his aunt's old Ouija board, his face lit with excitement. "Ready to do this?" Jake asked, his voice carrying a mix of thrill and apprehension. Nina Rodriguez, with her long black hair and flowy dress billowing as she moved, gave a nervous chuckle. "As ready as we'll ever be," she replied, her dark eyes reflecting the candlelight. Paul Fletcher, the skeptic among us, rolled his eyes but joined us at the table anyway. He was tall and athletic, his frame looming over the delicate board. I, Emma Thompson, felt a thrill of fear and curiosity, my fingers tingling as I placed them on the planchette. The basement was a shadowy cave, lit only by the circle of candles Jake had placed around the table. Every flicker of their flames cast eerie shadows that danced on the walls. Rain hammered against the small, dirt-smeared window, and distant thunder rumbled, setting the perfect stage for our dabbling in the unknown. Jake started with the typical question, his voice hushed. "Is anyone there?" We waited, breaths held, but the planchette remained motionless. Smirking, Paul was about to break the silence when the planchette jerked under our fingertips, moving slowly to yes. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Nina's eyes widened, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you?" The planchette moved again, more steadily this time, spelling out a name that sent a shiver down our collective spines. Amarthiel. Amarthiel? Jake repeated, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. "What do you want?" The planchette slid faster now, almost impatiently. "YOU." The air grew colder, our breaths turning to visible puffs of mist. Fear and excitement mingled in the thick, cold air. We exchanged glances, unsure of what to do next. The game had suddenly turned very real. "Should we keep going?" I asked, hearing the tremor in my own voice. "Yeah, Jake said, his determination masking his trepidation. Let's see what it wants. When will you leave us alone? Paul asked, his skepticism starting to waver. The planchette didn't hesitate, spelling out another chilling phrase. Willneerleave. That was when the candles flickered, their lights dancing violently before all went out, plunging us into darkness. We scrambled to our feet, bumping into each other, panic rising. Jake, do something! Nina cried out, her voice trembling. Jake found a flashlight and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal our terrified faces. We were no longer naive teenagers seeking a thrill. We were playthings in the hands of a sinister force. We hastily performed a closing ritual, not really knowing what we were doing, but desperate to end the session. The board remained silent, the planchette still. We left Jake's basement that night, our hearts pounding with fear and adrenaline, convincing ourselves that it was just a game. But deep down, we knew something had changed. The spirit we contacted had left a mark on us, a haunting promise that we couldn't shake off. Years passed, and our little group moved on with life, the memories of that night slowly fading, until now. 10 years later, the whispers started again, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, every echo of the past coming back to haunt us. One night, alone in my apartment, I heard it clearly. A soft, almost familiar whisper. Youaremine. My heart raced as I grabbed the phone, dialing Jake's number. He answered almost immediately, his voice filled with the same dread I felt. Emma, it's happening again. We need to gather. With that, the stage was set for the final act of our pact with Amarthiel. This time, it felt like there would be no escape. As the night deepened, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shadows moved in my peripheral vision, and a cold, suffocating presence seemed to linger just out of reach. Sleep was out of the question, and the night stretched on endlessly, filled with the sound of my own rapid heartbeat. The following day, I met up with Jake. His once vibrant blue eyes looked hollow, dark circles highlighting his exhaustion. We have to bring Nina and Paul into this, he said, his voice resolute. Nina was the worst off. She had been in and out of psychiatric care, tormented by visions she refused to describe. When we visited her, her frail form seemed even more fragile. Her eyes darted around the room as if she could see the spirit lingering just outside our view. It's still here, she murmured, clutching my hand so tightly that her nails dug into my skin. It never left. Paul, who had tried to forget that night with stubborn denial, was reluctantly drawn back into the fold. Despite his initial skepticism, the relentless insomnia he suffered had drained the color from his life. I thought it was just a game, he muttered, running a hand through his disheveled hair. I thought we were just being stupid kids. But the truth was undeniable now. The pact we made 10 years ago had bound us together in a way we never understood, and Amarthiel was coming to collect. That evening, with a sense of grim resignation, we gathered once more in Jake's basement. The atmosphere was oppressively heavy, the air almost electric with anticipation. It felt as if the storm from our past had returned, the howling wind and hammering rain echoing our rising dread. We placed the old Ouija board on the table, our fingers trembling as they touched the dusty planchette. The candles flickered ominously, casting twisted shadows that seemed to reach out towards us. Taking a deep breath, I asked the question that had haunted us for years. Is anyone there? The planchette moved immediately, forcefully, spelling out the response that froze my blood. Y-E-S. The air in the basement grew colder, the shadows lengthening and contorting as if they were alive. Our breaths became visible again, and the reality of our situation hit us like a freight train. We were no longer just playing with the supernatural. We were confronting a nightmare that had been waiting for a decade. What do you want? Jake asked, his voice steady but his eyes betraying his fear. The planchette moved so quickly it was hard to keep up. Y-O-U. And with that, the true horror of our situation became clear. This was no longer a game. It was a reckoning. The spirit we had summoned was here to claim what we had unknowingly promised. The candles flickered violently before snuffing out, plunging the room into an oppressive darkness. In the silence, we heard Nina start to sob, her fragile mental state unraveling further under the pressure. We scrambled for the flashlight, And when Jake finally managed to click it on, the beam cut through the darkness to reveal our terrified faces. The pact had come back to haunt us, and this time, we couldn't run away. The spirit had been patient, it had waited, and now it was time to collect. The real terror was just beginning. We knew we had to talk to Nina, as her torment had always seemed the most severe. The next day, Jake, Paul, and I drove to the psychiatric facility where Nina had been staying. The facility was bleak, its stark white walls and sterile halls amplifying the sense of despair. When we entered Nina's room, the sight of her frail form was heartbreaking. Her once lustrous black hair was now lifeless and tangled, her olive skin pale against the white sheets. She looked up at us with dark, haunted eyes, her hands trembling. "You came back," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I knew you would." "Nina, we need to know what you've been seeing," I said softly, sitting on the edge of her bed. "We need your help to understand what's happening." She held my hand tightly, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so weak. "It's always there," she murmured, watching, whispering. "It won't leave us alone." Jake leaned in, his voice gentle but urgent. "Nina, what did it say? What did Amarthiel tell you?" She closed her eyes, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He wants us. He wants our souls for the pact. We have to go back to the basement. It's the only way." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. The basement. The place where it all began, and the place where it would all end. We had no choice. We had to confront Amarthiel and face the consequences of our actions. We brought Nina back to Jake's house, supporting her frail form as we descended into the basement. The air was colder than ever, an icy chill that seeped into our bones. The Ouija board was still on the table, the planchette waiting, almost as if it knew we would return. As we gathered around the table, Nina's eyes darted nervously around the room. "He's here," she whispered. "I can feel him." The planchette began to move on its own, spelling out a word that made my blood run cold. P-A-C-T. "What does that mean?" Paul asked, his voice shaking. "What is this pact?" The planchette continued to move, spelling out another chilling message. B-I-N-D. Nina started to tremble, her eyes rolling back as she screamed, "No, no, please leave us alone." Jake and I held her down, trying to keep her calm, but the temperature in the room dropped even further. Our breaths were visible, and the shadows in the corners seemed to grow, creeping closer. "We need to know what he wants," Jake shouted, his voice barely audible over Nina's screams. The planchette moved with frightening speed, spelling out a final message. Y-O-U-R-T-I-E-I-S-U-P. Suddenly, the room went silent, the candles snuffed out, and we were plunged into darkness once more. Jake's flashlight cut through the gloom, but the beam flickered uncertainly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Nina stopped screaming, her body going limp in our arms. "He's here," she whispered, her voice a faint echo. "He's come to collect." A cold wind swept through the basement, and the sense of dread became almost suffocating. The shadows seemed to pulse and writhe as if they had a life of their own. I felt something brush against my skin, a touch as cold as death. We were not alone in the basement. Amarthiel was with us, and he was ready to claim what he believed was his. Jake tightened his grip on the flashlight, his knuckles white. "What do we do, Emma? How do we stop this?" "We can't run," I replied, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my heart. "We have to face him. We need to know the truth about the pact." We placed our hands back on the planchette, our fingers trembling. The Ouija board began to move again, spelling out a message that would seal our fate. G-I-V-E-U-P and Y-O-U-W-I-L-L-I-V-E. We exchanged a look of horror. Amarthiel was offering us a chance to end this nightmare, but the price was too high. Our lives were bound to the pact, and surrendering meant losing everything we had ever known. "I won't give up," Jake said defiantly, his voice rising above the whispers that filled the room. "We'll find a way to break the pact." But as the planchette moved one final time, spelling out a word that sent a shiver down our spines, I realized with growing terror that there might be no way out. D-E-A-T-H. The shadows surged forward, enveloping us in a suffocating darkness. Nina's screams echoed in my ears as the world around me seemed to blur and distort. The last thing I saw was the planchette, moving on its own, mocking us with a sinister clarity. We were trapped, bound by a promise we never fully understood. And now, the spirit we had summoned 10 years ago was ready to collect its due. The oppressive darkness was suffocating, and I struggled to maintain my grip on reality. The air was so thick with cold that I could barely breathe. Nina's screams had subsided into haunting echoes, leaving the basement eerily silent. Jake's flashlight flickered and then died, plunging us into absolute darkness. "We need to find the candles," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper, filled with determination and fear. I fumbled blindly in the dark, my hands trembling as I searched for a match. My fingers brushed against the rough texture of the matchbox, and I quickly struck a match, the small flame casting an ephemeral circle of light around us. We managed to light the candles, their flickering flames barely holding back the darkness. Nina remained motionless, her eyes vacant as we huddled around the table. Paul, usually so composed, was visibly shaking. "What do we do now?" he whispered, his voice cracking. I picked up the voice recorder, my fingers shaking, and spoke into it in a trembling voice. "We're here in Jake's basement, trying to confront the spirit of Amarthiel. We've just received a message that our time is up. If anyone listens to this, know that we tried to break the pact, but the spirit is powerful. We can't seem to escape it." As I set down the recorder, a sudden bone-chilling wind blew through the basement, extinguishing the candles once more. We were plunged back into darkness, but this time an icy hand gripped my wrist. I gasped, feeling the cold seep into my bones. "He's here," Nina whispered, her voice echoing in the darkness. "He's going to take us." Jake's voice cut through the fear. "We need to stand together. We can't let him take us one by one." Just as he finished speaking, the darkness seemed to come alive. Shadows crept along the walls, extending ethereal tendrils that wrapped around Jake's leg. He struggled, trying to kick them off, but they held firm. "I won't let him take me," he shouted, desperation coloring his voice. In a moment of panic, Paul ran towards the basement stairs. But as he reached the steps, something yanked him back into the shadows. His scream was abruptly cut off, leaving only a chilling silence. With Jake fighting the shadows and Paul taken, I knew I was next. The air grew colder, and I could feel the malevolent presence closing in. I reached out, grabbing hold of Jake's hand. "We have to do this together," I yelled, trying to keep my voice steady. Jake nodded, his face set in a grim determination. "Emma, whatever happens, don't give up." We both placed our free hands back on the planchette, the one link we had to the spirit. The board moved once more, slowly, deliberately, spelling out a final message, SOULSMIN. The darkness surged forward, wrapping around us like a cloak. Jake's hand was ripped from mine, and his fading scream reverberated through the basement. I felt myself being pulled into the cold void, my grip on reality slipping. In the final moments, I managed to grab the voice recorder and spoke into it with my last ounce of strength. "I'm Emma Thompson. We tried to break free, but Amarthiel is too strong. This is not a game. If you find this recording, please don't make the same mistake." As my consciousness faded, I felt the icy grip tighten around me. The last thing I saw was the flickering light of the recorder, then nothing but darkness. I finished my tale, staring into the empty basement, realizing I was entirely alone. The weight of what had happened pressed down on me, the silence more deafening than any scream. I could feel the cold breath of the spirit on my neck, but I refused to give in to the fear. For now, I had to leave this record as a warning. With shaking hands, I set the voice recorder on the table and whispered, "This is Emma Thompson's final warning. He's still here, and he's coming for you." I stood slowly, feeling the presence looming over me. Step by step, I made my way up the basement stairs, each creak underfoot echoing like a death knell. As I reached the top, I turned back one last time. The basement was a void of darkness, and I knew in my heart that I would never truly escape. But maybe, just maybe, someone could learn from our folly and avoid the fate that awaited us. As I closed the door behind me, I heard the final chilling whisper of Amarthiel, ORENEXT. Terrified but resolved, I left the house, knowing that my story was no longer just a memory. It was a dire warning.
I woke up to an empty bed, reaching out for the familiar warmth beside me. Confused, I blinked against the sunlight filtering through the curtains. My hand met only cold, empty sheets. I glanced around, half expecting to see Emily standing nearby, maybe with a teasing smile and a morning coffee. But the room was empty, silent save for the distant chirping of birds. "Emily?" I called, my voice breaking the stillness. No answer. I sat up, a knot forming in my stomach. Emily always woke up before me, tiptoeing around to avoid waking me. But she never left without a trace. Sliding out of bed, I searched the bedroom. Her robe, usually hung on the back of the door, was missing. Her slippers weren't by the bedside. I headed to the bathroom, my heart pounding. Everything was in place, except for the absence of her toothbrush, her makeup, anything that showed another person lived here. Panic gnawed at me. I threw on some clothes and continued my search. Downstairs, the kitchen was as I left it the night before. But Emily's favorite mug wasn't on the counter, and there was no sign of her breakfast ritual. I checked the living room, the backyard. Every room felt eerily untouched, like a stage set after the actors had left. My mind raced. Was she playing a prank? Had she left for an emergency? I grabbed my phone, dialing her number. It went straight to voicemail. I tried her friends, my own friends, anyone who might have seen her. Each conversation was met with confusion, as if they had no idea who Emily was. The knot in my stomach tightened. I checked our wedding photos on the mantel, only to find empty frames. The photo albums stored in the hall closet were devoid of any evidence of our life together. Just blank pages where cherished memories should have been. She must be somewhere, I muttered to myself, trying to rein in the rising dread. She has to be. I decided to call Martin, a childhood friend and private investigator. "Martin, I need your help," I said, my voice trembling. "Emily is missing. Everything about her is gone." There was a long pause before Martin responded, his tone cautious. "David, are you sure? Maybe you're just tired or stressed. Maybe she's out for a while." "No, you don't understand," I insisted. "It's like she never existed." Martin's skepticism was palpable, but he agreed to meet me later that day. In the meantime, I ransacked the house for any sign of Emily. Cabinets, drawers, old boxes in the attic, nothing. Every trace of her had vanished. Hours later, when Martin arrived, I led him through the house, showing him the empty frames and the void where Emily's belongings once were. He listened, brows furrowed, doubt etched across his face. "David, I don't know what to say," Martin finally admitted. "This doesn't make any sense. Are you sure?" "I'm not crazy, Martin," I snapped, my frustration boiling over. "I know my wife. I know she was here." Martin raised his hands in a placating gesture. Okay. Let's look into this together. Maybe there's an explanation we haven't considered." We started with Emily's workplace. The school where she taught was a short drive away. The moment we walked in, the receptionist greeted me with a blank stare when I asked for Emily. "I'm sorry, who?" the receptionist asked, her tone polite but puzzled. "Emily Thompson. She works here. 5th grade teacher," I replied, anxiety gnawing at me. The receptionist shook her head. "There's no one by that name here." I felt my world tilting. Martin stepped in, his authoritative voice cutting through my disbelief. "Could you check again? This is very important." The receptionist frowned, tapping away at her computer. A few tense minutes later, she looked up, shaking her head again. "I'm sorry, but there's no record of an Emily Thompson ever working here." Martin placed a comforting hand on my shoulder, his expression grim. "Let's keep looking, David. Maybe there's another explanation." As we left the school, I felt a growing sense of dread. How could Emily have been erased so completely? Every step we took in our search seemed to push me further into an unfathomable nightmare. Days turned into a haze of confusion and futile searches. No one remembered her. It was as if she had been plucked out of existence, leaving me alone in a world that no longer made sense. One night, in a fit of desperation, I stormed into the attic. Frenzied, I tore through boxes of old belongings, desperately seeking anything that tied Emily to this reality. As I rummaged through the clutter, my hand brushed against a hidden drawer at the bottom of an old trunk. I yanked it open, my heart racing. Inside, I found a collection of mementos, a dried rose from our first date, a ticket stub from a concert, and a faded photograph of Emily and me. Tears welled in my eyes as I cradled these precious remnants of our life together. At the bottom of the drawer was a single yellowed note, written in Emily's handwriting. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. "If you're reading this," the note began, "it's already too late. They've rewritten our lives. I stared at the note, my mind struggling to comprehend the message. THUYHVWRITN-ORLIVS. The words echoed in my mind, a haunting refrain in an endless loop. The note slipped from my trembling fingers, settling back into the drawer. Emily's message echoed in my mind, creating a dissonant symphony of confusion and dread. I crumpled to the floor, the hidden mementos scattered around me, remnants of a life that, according to everyone else, never existed. I stared at Emily's handwriting, my mind racing. Rewritten our lives? What did that mean? And who were they? My head throbbed with questions that felt like they had no hope of answers. David, are you okay? Martin's voice jolted me from my reverie. He had been watching me from the attic entrance, concern etched across his face. I handed him the note. She knew, Martin. She knew something was happening. Martin read the note, his expression shifting from confusion to incredulity. I don't even know what this is. I'm not crazy, I insisted, the words barely more than a whisper. Emily was real, and she knew something that I don't. Martin sighed, rubbing his temples. All right, let's figure this out. Maybe there's more to this than we can see. As night fell, the already strange atmosphere became even more oppressive. Every creak of the house, every flicker of the lights seemed amplified, sending shivers down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if unseen eyes were tracking my every move. Let's retrace your steps, Martin suggested, his voice practical. Maybe there's something we've missed. We started by going through my call logs, text messages, and emails, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain Emily's sudden erasure. But each search was as empty as the last. It was as if a meticulously planned sabotage had erased her from every aspect of my life. Late into the night, exhausted and frustrated, we decided to take a break. Martin offered to stay over, reluctant to leave me alone in my agitated state. I was grateful for his presence, a tie to a world that still made some sense. As Martin settled on the couch, I wandered back upstairs, drawn again to the attic where I had found the note. The room felt heavier, the shadows deeper. Suddenly I saw a flicker of movement from the corner of my eye. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. The sensation of being watched pressed in on me, more suffocating than before. I backed up nervously, only to trip over a box and crash to the floor. As I struggled to my feet, the shadows in the attic seemed to shift and twist, forming vague, menacing shapes. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice breaking. The oppressive silence that followed was unnerving. My skin prickled with the awareness of an unseen presence. I grabbed a flashlight, shining it into the darkened corners. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but dust and old furniture. Still, the feeling of being observed wouldn't leave me. "David?" Martin called from downstairs, his voice muffled but concerned. "I'm fine," I called back, but as I descended the stairs, the oppressive sensation of being watched followed me. I tried to shake it off, but sleep was elusive that night. Every time I closed my eyes, images of Emily's note plagued me, blending into dark dreams of shadowy figures and rewritten lives. A few nights later, things took a more terrifying turn. I was alone in the living room, sifting through old memories when the room's temperature seemed to plummet. My breath came out in visible puffs, despite the heating being on. The shadows in the corners of the room grew darker, more defined, and I felt a coldness seeping into my bones. The air felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't see or understand. Suddenly, the shadows began to move, creeping along the walls and floor like living oil. Panic surged through me as I watched them converge, forming the outline of a figure in the center of the room. "Who are you?" I demanded, desperation lacing my voice. The shadowy figure did not respond, but I felt its presence intensify. A cold, disembodied whisper drifted to my ears, a chilling blend of menace and sorrow. "You were not meant to remember," it hissed, the words slicing through the air. "MEANTTOREEMBER." I stumbled backward, my legs trembling. The figure dissipated, the shadows retreating back to their corners, leaving the room as it was before. But the cold, aching fear remained. I called Martin immediately, unable to keep the terror out of my voice. He listened as I breathlessly recounted what had happened. "I believe you, David," he said quietly, his earlier skepticism now replaced with genuine concern. "Whatever is happening, it's beyond anything we can understand. but we'll figure it out, together. In that moment, with the phone to my ear and my heart still racing, I realized that the boundaries of my reality had been breached, and I was standing on the edge of an incomprehensible abyss. Emily's note echoed in my mind, the chilling reality of rewritten lives settling into my bones. The days blurred into one nightmarish sequence, each filled with an uneasy sense that my reality was crumbling. The hours I didn't spend obsessively searching for answers, I spent haunted by the chilling encounters with those strange entities. Martin, ever the cautious investigator, stuck by me, continuing to lend his support and pragmatism. One evening, Martin and I were sitting in the living room, reviewing documents. He paused, looking at me with a mixture of concern and determination. "David, I think we need to confront whatever this is directly. We can't keep running or hiding." I nodded, a grim resolve settling over me. We need to confront these shadows. As night fell, the air grew heavy again, and a familiar chill settled in, seeping through the walls. We positioned ourselves in the center of the living room, the only light coming from the flickering fireplace. The shadows seemed thicker, darker, as if the night itself was congealing into something sentient. The temperature plummeted. My breath came out in clouds, visible in the cold air. Martin and I shared a look, a silent agreement to stand our ground. The shadows began to move, creeping along the floor, walls, and ceiling, converging once again to form a nebulous figure. It stood before us, a void of darkness that seemed to swallow the light. I clenched my fists, forcing my voice to remain steady. "What do you want? Why are you doing this?" The shadow figure did not reply immediately. Instead, the cold whisper I'd come to dread began to fill the room. "You were not meant to remember. MEANTTEEMEMBER." Martin stepped forward, his voice firm. "Why rewrite our lives? What's the purpose?" The figure's form wavered, as if considering whether to answer. Then, in that same chilling whisper, it spoke. "We protect the fabric of reality. Some must be forgotten to maintain balance." BALANCE. She was real, I argued, my voice rising with desperation. Emily was real. Our life was real. The figure's whisper seemed to echo from all around us. "She was never meant to be. She disrupted the order. The memory of her endangers you." Martin's face tightened with determination. "That's a lie. We have proof she existed." The figure shifted, and suddenly I felt a pull, a force drawing on my mind. Images of Emily flashed before me, distorted memories blending with new, unwelcome ones. My knees buckled under the weight of the mental onslaught. Martin grabbed my arm, steadying me. "David, fight it!" In a moment of clarity, I forced myself to remember Emily, her laughter, her warmth, the love that had bound us together. I felt a surge of strength, pushing the invasive presence away. The shadow figure recoiled, its form destabilizing. "Your defiance endangers you," it hissed. ENDANGERSYOU. I faced it, breathing hard. "I'd rather die with my memories than live in your rewritten reality." The figure wavered once more, then dissipated, the shadows retreating as quickly as they had come. The room warmed almost instantly, the sense of oppressive doom lifting. Martin looked at me, concern and pride mingling in his expression. "I think we won. They won't be back." But deep down, I knew better. The battle wasn't over. I could feel it in the fragments of reality that had been tampered with, in the quiet whispers that still occasionally haunted my dreams. The next morning I woke with a sense of dread. The house, our once vibrant home, felt even more distorted. The room seemed slightly different, colors less vivid. It was as if reality was struggling to correct itself, but failing. I stumbled into the bathroom, splashing water on my face, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. As I looked into the mirror, the reflection stared back at me, unfamiliar in some ways. It was me, but slightly altered, as if the very nature of who I was had been rewritten. I thought of Emily's note, the ominous warning. She had known something profound, something I was only beginning to grasp. As I left the bathroom, Martin called from the kitchen, offering a semblance of normalcy over breakfast. I joined him, but the food tasted bland, the colors muted. Everything felt off. We sat in silence, both of us knowing that this reality was now a fractured one. Martin sighed. "What's next?" I shook my head. "I don't know, but I have to keep searching. I have to find some way to fix this." Martin nodded, his eyes filled with a somber resolve. "We'll find a way, together." And so, the search continues. Each day, I wake in a world that feels increasingly alien. My memories of Emily both a solace and a curse. I know that confronting the fabric of our reality comes with a price I am willing to pay to hold on to the truth of who we were. As for the shadowy figures, they remain a haunting presence on the edges of my consciousness. The fight for my reality, for the memory of Emily, has only just begun. Title: My shift on the 8th floor. The moment the camera on the 8th floor flicked off and then on again, I dismissed it as a glitch. But when it happened 3 more times, I couldn't ignore the cold sense of dread creeping up my spine. What was lurking up there? It was around 2:30 a.m., during one of those graveyard shifts where the hours drag on. I sat in the dimly lit security room, the blue glow of multiple monitors casting eerie shadows on the walls. The cameras covered every corner of the office building, empty hallways, silent stairwells, and motionless office cubicles. Tonight, though, something felt different, more off. I found myself staring at the monitor displaying the 8th floor. The screen flickered again, just for a second, but long enough to catch my attention. I've dealt with these glitches before. They usually meant nothing. But this one sent a shiver down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and keys, and against my better judgment, decided to check it out. The elevator ride to the 8th floor felt unusually long, the hum of the machinery a low drone in the background. When the doors slid open, I was hit by a gust of cold air, the kind of cold that seemed unnatural, almost intrusive. The corridor lights were dimmed, shadows pooling in every corner. My footsteps echoed eerily, each step magnifying my sense of solitude. There was a faint, almost imperceptible whispering sound somewhere in the distance, too soft to decipher, but enough to set my nerves on edge. As I walked, my flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping past cubicles and offices. Suddenly I saw movement in the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, heart pounding. It was just a reflection, a bizarre, warped reflection in the large window at the end of the corridor. But it didn't look like me. No, the figure was taller, almost grotesque in its proportions, and for a split second I could have sworn it waved. An uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. I tried to rationalize it, but every fiber of my being screamed that something wasn't right. The air felt even colder as I approached the end of the corridor. The whispering grew louder, yet more indistinct, like multiple voices layered over one another, creating an oppressive murmur. I reached the server room. The door, usually locked, was slightly ajar. My hand hesitated on the handle, but my curiosity pushed me forward. Inside, the room was darker and colder than the rest of the floor. A monitor was on, which was odd. These systems were never supposed to be powered until morning. Approaching the monitor, I saw the screen filled with lines of garbled text. It looked like meaningless code, or perhaps a malfunction. But right there, among the jumbled characters, was my name repeating over and over, DAVIDTHOMPSON. Every hair on my body stood on end. I backed out of the room, the whispering now a guttural hiss filling my ears. Turning swiftly, I nearly collided with a tall, dark figure standing in the corridor. It wasn't human, more like a shadow, smoke that had taken form. Its face, if you could call it that, was an abyss of nothingness. I blinked and it vanished. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst from my chest. I ran, sprinting back to the elevator, my flashlight bouncing erratically in my hand. I slammed my fist on the button, desperate for the doors to open. When they finally did, I stumbled inside, jabbing the ground floor button repeatedly. The ride down seemed to last an eternity. The lights in the elevator flickered, and I could see my reflection on the metal door. It was twisted, moving unnaturally. Beside me, a tall, dark figure appeared in the reflection, standing still, watching. Cold breath hit my neck. The elevator doors opened with a ding, and I bolted into the lobby, nearly tripping in my panic. My skin was clammy, my breath ragged. I couldn't get the image out of my head, the sight of that dark figure, and the oppressive sense of being watched. I reported the incident to Mark the next morning. He laughed it off, attributing it to sleep deprivation. The cameras, he said, showed nothing unusual. No flickering lights, no figures, nothing. But I knew what I saw, what I felt. Was I losing my mind, or was there something genuinely sinister on that floor? Either way, I resolved to avoid the 8th floor from then on. Yet some nights, I can't shake the feeling that it's just waiting, lurking, and watching for its next visitor. Part 2. My heart was still pounding when I returned to my station. Rational explanations swirled through my mind, but none seemed sufficient. Days turned into nights, and I tried to avoid the 8th floor, running my patrols on autopilot. Yet every now and then, the cold, whispered voices haunted my thoughts. A week later, I was at it again, my curiosity getting the better of me. I found myself drawn back to the floor like a moth to flame. This time, I brought along an extra flashlight and a portable radio, just for my peace of mind. I walked down the corridor again, hearing the faint whispering grow louder as I approached the server room. My breath was shallow and sweat beaded on my forehead, despite the biting cold. I opened the server room door. The monitor was on again, but this time the text was even more incomprehensible, a chaotic mess of symbols and letters. And again, my name stood out amongst the chaos, an ominous repetition that felt personal. Davidcommetous. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. The whispering had now turned into an urgent guttural hiss. I swung the flashlight around, and there, standing at the doorway, was the tall, dark figure. I froze, my blood running cold. It moved closer, and with each step, the temperature seemed to plummet further. Adrenaline kicked in, and I pushed past it, feeling a strange, icy resistance as my body passed through where it stood. I ran down the corridor, my footsteps echoing hauntingly behind me. Reaching the elevator, I pounded the button until the doors finally opened. For the next few nights, I stuck to the lower floors, trying to rationalize what I had encountered. My resolve began to waver, and I found it hard to focus on my duties. Seeing Claire during her rounds was a welcome distraction. One late shift, I mentioned the strange occurrences to Claire, trying to keep it casual. She laughed nervously, her eyes darting around the corridor. "Don't joke about stuff like that," she said, shaking her head. "This building is creepy enough at night." I chuckled along, but deep down, her dismissive attitude didn't ease my anxiety. If anything, it made me feel more isolated. She offered a brief moment of normalcy, but as soon as she left, the silence returned, heavier than ever. Later, I decided to confide in Mark. The next morning, I laid out my experiences in detail. His face remained stoic as I recounted my encounters, the flickering lights, the whispers, the dark figure. "David, you know how night shifts can mess with your mind. Maybe you need a break," Mark suggested, his tone gentle but dismissive. "Or some extra rest. There's a perfectly rational explanation for all this." I wanted to believe him, to attribute it all to lack of sleep or overactive imagination. But those encounters felt so real, so immediate. The coldness, the whispers, it wasn't something I could shake off. Mark's reassurance did little to calm the growing knot of fear in my stomach. Several days later, during another patrol, I found myself once again drawn to the 8th floor. The rational part of me screamed to stay away, but something deeper urged me on. This time, I noticed Claire's cleaning cart near the elevator and felt a brief sense of relief. Maybe having someone else around would help dispel the fear. "Hey, Claire!" I called out, my voice echoing in the hallway. She emerged from a cubicle, a welcoming smile on her face. "Need some company up here?" she joked, sensing my unease. "Yeah, the silence is getting to me," I admitted, trying to sound casual. We chatted about mundane things, her kids, my routine, as she cleaned. Her presence was a balm, temporarily easing the oppressive atmosphere. But even as we spoke, I couldn't shake off the feeling that we were being watched. Claire glanced at her watch, sighing. "Well, I've got to finish up. Stay safe, okay?" She waved and disappeared down the hallway. As her footsteps faded, the familiar coldness crept back in. The sense of being alone hit harder than ever. I glanced down the corridor to where she had just been, wondering if she felt what I did. Or maybe it was just my own paranoia. Resuming my patrol, I took one last look around before heading to the elevator. The whispers seemed to follow, growing louder with each step, each moment feeling more oppressive and inescapable. Part 3. The days turned into a blur of dread and uncertainty. I avoided the 8th floor like the plague, but the unease gnawed at my sanity. My mind was a churning sea of doubt and fear. Sleep eluded me. my restive nights filled with fragments of whispered voices and lurking shadows. One night, exhausted and desperate for clarity, I resolved to confront whatever it was head-on. Armed with my flashlight and a sense of grim determination, I stepped into the 8th floor again. The familiar chill greeted me, wrapping around me like an unwelcome embrace. The dim lights flickered ominously, casting ghostly shadows along the corridor. I moved forward, every footstep a battle against the creeping fear. Suddenly, the corridor behind me went entirely dark. I spun around, flashlight beam barely cutting through the dense blackness. The air grew even colder, almost painfully so. The whispers returned, louder, more insistent. "M-O-R-T-A-L," they hissed, the sound seeming to crawl under my skin. I turned back towards the elevator and saw it, the tall, dark figure standing at the far end of the corridor. My heart raced as it began to glide silently toward me, its form shifting and undulating like smoke trapped in a twisted dance. Desperation fueled my actions. I bolted towards the elevator, not daring to look back. Slamming the buttons frantically, the doors slowly began to close. Just as they were about to shut completely, a cold hand touched my shoulder. Gasping, I spun around. The figure was inches away from me. Its face, an abyss of darkness, seemed to devour the very light around it. My breath froze in my lungs, every muscle paralyzed in primal terror. Then, just as suddenly, the doors shut fully and the elevator jolted downward. I collapsed against the wall, my leg muscles weak and trembling. Each floor passed with agonizing slowness, the air around me still frigid, and the faint whisper lingering. As I stumbled out into the lobby, I caught my reflection in the glass entrance doors. I looked pale, exhausted, a shadow of my former self. But behind me, in the glass, the figure loomed, its dark form waiting, watching. Reported the events to Mark once more, my voice shaking with every word. Predictably, he dismissed it again, confirming my isolation in my terror. However, he offered to move me to the day shift, attributing the experiences to the strain of working nights. I took the transfer gratefully, hoping the daylight would erase the haunting memories. But the shadows remained. I couldn't shake the sense of being watched, followed, even during the day. The whispers echoed in my thoughts, a constant reminder of the entity lurking on the 8th floor. To find some semblance of peace, I turned to the online community, detailing every harrowing moment. Maybe, just maybe, someone else had seen what I had, felt the same terror. I needed to know I wasn't alone, that this wasn't just my mind unraveling. And now, as I write this, I still wonder if that presence has truly been left behind. It's been quiet, for now. But every creak in the building, every shadow that shifts out of the corner of my eye, it's a reminder. A reminder that perhaps some doors once opened can never truly be closed. Have you ever felt eyes on you, even when you're sure you're alone? That haunting sensation started the night I knocked on the door of Unit 5B to welcome my new neighbor. Little did I know, Vincent was no ordinary tenant, and I was about to uncover a chilling truth that would shatter my understanding of reality. I had just moved into this apartment complex last month, seeking a fresh start after a brutal breakup. It wasn't anything fancy, but it suited my needs. Quiet, decent rent, and close enough to work. Besides, I was optimistic about the change, figuring a new environment might help me get back on my feet. The first sign of trouble came through the building's management app. I got a notification that read, "New neighbor in 5B." I should have felt indifferent. People come and go all the time. But there was something about it that set me on edge, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. That evening, after a long day filled with troubleshooting computer systems and dealing with irate clients, I decided to pay a visit to the new tenant. I had always believed in being friendly, even if I viewed myself as a bit of an introvert. I knocked on the door and waited. An unsettlingly long pause followed before I heard the slow, deliberate sound of locks being undone. The door creaked open, and there stood Vincent. He was a man in his mid-40s, with dark, piercing eyes that seemed to look right through me. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his hair was short, slicked back in a manner that felt out of place for someone who just moved in. He looked at me without a word, his expression unreadable. "Hi, I'm Jordan, your neighbor from 5A," I said, forcing a smile. Just wanted to welcome you to the building. Vincent nodded slowly, his gaze never wavering. Thank you, he replied, his voice low and gravelly. Name's Vincent. The silence that followed was suffocating, and his unblinking stare made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I mumbled something about being around if he needed anything, and hurried back to my apartment, my mind reeling from the discomfort of the encounter. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on my bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling an inexplicable unease. Was it Vincent, or was it just the stress of the move and my recent breakup gnawing at me? I didn't know, and I tried convincing myself it was nothing, just a trick of the mind. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a faint noise. I sat up, trying to pinpoint its source. It sounded like whispers, but it was unclear, almost as if the walls themselves were murmuring secrets. I strained my ears, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. Groggily, I went to the kitchen for a glass of water. I noticed my keys weren't on the counter where I usually left them. My heart skipped a beat. They were in the bathroom cabinet instead. Maybe I had misplaced them, but it felt off, like a small piece of a larger, more menacing puzzle. The following morning, I tried to dismiss the incident, chalking it up to my exhaustion. But as the days passed, the unsettling feeling grew stronger. I would hear the whispers more frequently and find objects inexplicably moved. A framed photo of my family, sturdy on the wall, crashed to the ground, glass shards scattering across the floor. Then, late one night, I heard the unmistakable sound of metal scraping. My curiosity got the better of me. I crept to the door and peered through the peephole, my heart pounding. In the dim corridor, I saw Vincent, dragging a heavy bag that left a dark, wet trail behind it. The sight was both horrifying and mesmerizing, a slow-motion nightmare. Against my rational instincts, I followed him. The dimly lit hallway led to the basement, a place I had rarely explored. Vincent moved with purpose, oblivious to my presence. He reached a rusted metal door at the far end, opening it to reveal an abyss of darkness. A rancid smell hit me, a sickening blend of rot and decay. I hid behind a stack of old boxes, my heart hammering in my chest. Vincent dragged the bag into the room, leaving the door ajar. I could hear the wet squelch of whatever was inside, accompanied by the sound of buzzing flies. The stench was overwhelming, nearly making me gag. Summoning every ounce of courage, I crept closer, peering into the room. What I saw sent a jolt of terror through me. The walls were smeared with crimson symbols, their meanings unknown but undeniably sinister. In the center of the room stood a makeshift altar, adorned with bones and tattered remains. It looked like the site of an ancient, malevolent ritual. A hand suddenly gripped my shoulder, and I turned to face Vincent's enraged eyes inches from mine. "You shouldn't be here," he hissed. "I-T-S-H-A-T-T-E-R-E-D-Y-O-U-R-U-N-D-E-R-S-T-A-N-D-I-N-F-R-E-A-L-I-T-Y." The words echoed in my mind as I sprinted back to my apartment, locking the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night barricading it with furniture, trembling with a fear that refused to dissipate. The following morning, the sunlight filtering through my blinds did little to dispel the dread clinging to me. I could still feel Vincent's grip on my shoulder, his rage palpable as if he stood right behind me. My threshold for normalcy had been shattered, and I knew I wasn't dealing with anything ordinary. Days went by in a haze. I avoided Vincent, but the unsettling occurrences in my apartment continued. Whispers at odd hours, objects moving without explanation. It was as though my reality was bending, twisting into something unrecognizable. Then, one night, it reached a peak. I woke up in the dead of night, again to the sound of scraping metal. My heart pounded as I peeked through the peephole. Vincent, with the same heavy bag, was dragging it toward the basement. The dark trail behind him was even more prominent this time, a grotesque breadcrumb trail. Compelled by equal parts fear and curiosity, I dressed quickly and followed him, maintaining a safe distance. He seemed oblivious to my presence, focused on his grim task. I watched him unlock the rusted door to that vile room, noting the way he moved, almost ritualistic, like he was performing some dark rite. Once Vincent disappeared into the darkness, I resolved to get closer. I needed to know what was in that bag. Holding my breath, I crept up to the door, the rancid smell even more overpowering than before. I squinted into the dim light, trying to make sense of the scene inside. The bag lay open on the floor, its contents a mass of rotting flesh and bones. My stomach churned, bile rising as I forced myself to look around. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse with a macabre life of their own. The altar was more intricate now, adorned with fresh bones and what looked like animal sacrificial remnants. My pulse raced. I had to get out of there before Vincent realized I was spying on him. Just as I turned to leave, a hand clamped down on my shoulder again. I whipped around to see Vincent's face, contorted with fury, mere inches from mine. His breath was hot, and his eyes bore into mine, making my blood run cold. "You shouldn't be here," he spat, his voice dripping with malevolence. Pure adrenaline kicked in, and I broke free, sprinting down the corridor. I could hear Vincent's footsteps hard on my heels, his breathing heavy with rage. My feet pounded against the cold floor, my lungs burning with the effort of escape. Just as I reached my apartment, I slammed the door shut and bolted it. I threw furniture against it, creating a makeshift barricade. My heart hammered in my chest, the fear morphing into pure terror as I heard Vincent's muffled voice outside, whispering sinister threats. "Y-O-U-R-E-N-E-X-T." Those words echoed in my head as I curled up on the couch, clutching a kitchen knife for whatever comfort it could provide. I didn't sleep that night, too terrified Vincent might break in. Morning brought an eerie calm. The sinister whispers were gone. Mustering every ounce of resolve, I checked the peephole. Nothing. I cautiously moved the furniture away from the door, half expecting Vincent to come, crashing in. But when I dared to open it and look out, the hallway was empty. Only silence greeted me. The next day, I ventured outside to clear my head. I needed to talk to the building manager. Someone had to know something about Vincent and what was happening in Unit 5B. I approached the front desk, trying to mask my desperation. "Hey, I need to talk to you about the guy in Unit 5B, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The manager, a middle-aged woman with an air of indifference, looked puzzled. "There's no one in Unit 5B, she replied, scanning through her computer. "We haven't had a tenant there for months. Are you sure you're not mistaken?" My blood ran cold. "What? No, I met him. Vincent. He's been there for weeks." She shook her head firmly. "I can assure you that unit's been vacant. Maintenance is scheduled to clean it out next week." Disbelief washed over me. How could Vincent vanish so completely, leaving no trace behind? My mind raced, struggling to piece together the fragments of this increasingly horrifying puzzle. Had I imagined it all? No, that couldn't be. It was too real, too visceral. Determined to find answers, I decided to investigate the basement once more. I needed to know if the dark room and its horrifying contents were still there. The rational side of my mind screamed at me to leave it alone, but I couldn't. Not now. I descended the stairwell, my footsteps echoing ominously. The corridor seemed longer this time, each step filled with dread. As I reached the rusted door, I took a deep breath and pushed it open. The stench had dissipated. The room was empty, save for dust-covered boxes and old furniture. No symbols, no altar, no remains, nothing. It was as if the room had never harbored those horrors, erasing any evidence of the nightmare I knew I had seen. Desperation clawed at me as I stood there, the cold, mundane reality of the basement pressing in on me. My mind felt fractured, teetering on the brink of disbelief. I stumbled back to my apartment, each step heavier than the last. That night, sleep eluded me once more. My thoughts were a chaotic whirlpool, Vincent's piercing eyes, the ghastly room, the chilling whispers. I was losing my grasp on normalcy, haunted by the inescapable feeling that Vincent was still watching somewhere in the shadows. In a last-ditch effort to make sense of it all, I typed out my experience on Reddit, hoping someone might believe me, might understand what I'd been through. My fingers flew over the keyboard, the words tumbling out in a frantic stream. "Please, if you ever get a new neighbor in Unit 5B, be careful. And whatever you do, stay out of the basement." Hitting the post button, I leaned back, feeling a semblance of release. Perhaps sharing my story could help me piece together the shattered remains of my sanity. And maybe, just maybe, it would prevent someone else from experiencing the same terror. The next morning, the unease that had haunted me took on a new form, one of resolute determination. I needed answers, even if it meant confronting my deepest fears. I decided to venture back to the basement one final time. As I descended the stairs, An oppressive silence pressed in around me. Reaching the rusted door, I hesitated, memories of the horrors I'd seen making my pulse race. Steeling myself, I stepped inside. But it looked different in the harsh light of day, ordinary, benign. The symbols, the altar, the grotesque remains were gone. It was just a forgotten storage room once more. Confusion and fear twisted inside me. Had I lost my mind? Was Vincent even real? I moved further in, scanning every shadowed corner, every inch of the walls. Nothing. There was no trace of the sinister tableau I'd witnessed. The bile rose in my throat as I heard a faint whisper echoing in my mind, a reminder of the horrors that kept unfolding the deeper I went. DONOTTRUSTWHTYOUSEE. The words pulsed in my head, as if Vincent himself were speaking directly into my mind. Unease morphed into a chilling certainty. I wasn't alone. I scrambled out of the room, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I couldn't shake the feeling that some unseen force was watching, stalking me. By the time I reached my apartment, I was trembling. I couldn't live like this. I decided to pack my things. I needed to leave, escape this nightmare. But even as I packed, my mind kept drifting back to the idea of posting my experience on Reddit. Maybe there, in the vast expanse of the internet, someone would believe me, maybe even help me make sense of it all. I knew it sounded crazy, but I had to try. Sitting down at my computer, I recounted everything. The eerie encounter with Vincent, the whispers, the unsettling sights in the basement, all of it. Typing, my hands shook, but I didn't stop until the last word was written. Have you ever felt eyes on you, even when you're sure you're alone? My neighbor in Unit 5B was no ordinary tenant. Please, if you ever get a new neighbor in 5B, be careful. And whatever you do, stay out of the basement. I hit post, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. As the screen refreshed, I saw the responses start to pour in, some sympathetic, others skeptical, and a few who had experienced similar things. Their stories echoed mine, chilling in their familiarity. My phone buzzed, startling me out of my reverie. It was a message from Sarah Livingston, a journalist who happened to see my post. She wanted to meet, claiming she had information about the building and previous tenants of Unit 5B. We agreed to meet in a nearby cafe. Sarah was punctual, blonde hair framing her inquisitive green eyes. She seemed professional yet approachable, a reassuring presence in my frazzled state. Jordan, I'm investigating strange occurrences in this building, she said, cutting straight to the point. You're not the first to experience this. Every tenant who lived in 5B either vanished or moved away suddenly, leaving no trace of their stay. What do you mean? I asked, curiosity and fear warring inside me. Vincent isn't real, not in the way you think. He's a manifestation, perhaps the building's dark history given form. Every few months he reappears, repeating the cycle, driving people to madness. Her words hit me like a hammer. The memories of Vincent's piercing gaze, his cold touch, they weren't the delusions of a deteriorating mind. They were echoes of something much darker, something no one should have to endure. How do we stop it? My voice trembled, desperation seeping through. She shook her head. I don't know if we can stop it, but we need to document it, bring it to light. If enough people know, maybe the power it holds will weaken. I returned to my apartment with a new purpose, my fear now tempered by determination. I needed to find any remaining evidence, anything to corroborate my experiences. I ventured back to the basement, Sarah by my side, armed with her camera and recorder. As we descended, I heard the whispers again, louder this time, resonating with an almost palpable malice. We reached the rusted door, and Sarah flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The room was empty, just as before. Sarah's face fell, the lack of physical proof a blow to our cause. But I knew what I'd heard, what I'd seen. I reached for my phone to record the whispers, but as I did, the lights flickered and the temperature plummeted. A chill ran down my spine as the whispers coalesced into a single, unmistakable phrase. L-E-A-V-E-N-O-W. Panic surged through me. We bolted, not stopping until we were back in the safety of the well-lit hallway. The feeling of eyes watching us, unseen and malevolent, never left. Sarah and I parted ways, her promising to investigate further, me feeling a strange mixture of hope and hopelessness. I packed my things more urgently now, ready to leave this nightmare behind. As I waited for the moving truck, I read through the supportive comments and the stories of others who had experienced similar horrors, reinforcing my resolve. Despite the fear, despite the doubt, sharing my story was the only way to fight back, to weaken the hold that Vincent, or whatever force he represented, had on this place. To anyone reading this, trust your instincts. If you ever move into an apartment and hear of someone new in Unit 5B, be wary, and whatever you do, stay out of the basement. As the last box was loaded and I took one final look at the building, a movement in the corner of my eye made me freeze. Turning slowly, I saw a dark figure standing at a distant window, watching. Vincent. I shivered, the memory of his piercing eyes etched into my soul as I drove away, leaving the building and its horrors behind. But the fear never truly left me. A constant reminder that some evils are not meant to be understood, only survived. It was a night I will never forget. Remember the night you mocked the spirits? It's a question etched into my mind, a reminder of our foolishness. The spirits were still listening, they were waiting, and now they've come for us, one by one. It's strange how clear my memories are from that night, considering the fear and chaos that followed. Emily had called me and Marco over to her grandmother's house, the old mansion known for its mysterious aura. When we arrived, she led us up a creaky staircase to the attic, where she'd discovered something intriguing amidst the dust-covered relics, an old Ouija board. "Check this out," Emily said excitedly, her blue eyes sparkling under the dim light of a single bulb hanging from the low ceiling. "Seriously?" I replied, rolling my eyes. "You really believe in this stuff?" Emily shrugged, her auburn curls bouncing slightly. "It's just for fun, Jamie. Come on, don't be such a skeptic." Marco, always up for something new, clapped me on the back. "Relax, man. Let's just see what happens," he said, his dimpled smile not hiding his nervous energy. We gathered around the board, a dusty relic with faded letters and numbers. An uneasy silence filled the attic as we placed our fingers on the planchette. The room's damp, musty air seemed to close in on us. "If there are any spirits here, make your presence known," Emily said, her voice trembling slightly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the planchette began to move. I watched, my skepticism fighting against the chill creeping up my spine. It moved slowly at first, spelling out a series of letters that made no sense. We exchanged nervous glances, and then it stopped on the letter E. "Okay, who's messing with us?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "It wasn't me," Marco said, his wide eyes betraying his fear. The planchette moved again, spelling more letters. ELIASISHERE. A cold shiver ran down my spine as the oppressive silence returned. "That's not funny," I muttered. I didn't know why, but deep down I felt that I had to defy it. "Prove you're here," I demanded, my voice a bit shakier than I intended. The response was almost immediate. A loud crash echoed from the dark corner of the attic. We jumped, hearts pounding, eyes straining to see through the shadows. The single bulb flickered ominously. "What was that?" Emily whispered, clutching Marco's arm. None of us dared to move. The silence felt like it was pressing in on us from all sides, as if the attic itself was holding its breath. A faint whispering sound started to permeate the room, growing louder and more agitated. We decided then that it was best to put the board away. As we hurried to leave the attic, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Emily, Marco, and I exchanged forced laughs, trying to shake off the fear as we descended the creaky stairs. But none of us mentioned what the board had spelled out. A few days later, small things started to happen. It began with minor, easily dismissible events. The creaking of floorboards in our homes, cold drafts on otherwise warm days, familiar smells from the past suddenly filling a room. One evening, Emily called us over again. We sat in her backyard, the chilled autumn air crisp with the scent of fallen leaves. She looked visibly shaken. "Guys, remember what the board said?" "The name?" she asked, her voice unsteady. Marco and I nodded. "I've been having these dreams," Emily continued. "In them, there's a man I've never seen before. He stands in the shadows and just watches." I tried to rationalize it. "It's just your mind playing tricks." We've been on edge since that night. But as the days passed, the occurrences became more frequent and harder to ignore. I came home one evening to find every light in my house flickering. Marco's usually strong and cheerful demeanor had begun to crack. He started avoiding his basement altogether, convinced he could hear someone whispering his name from below. "I swear I saw something move in my room last night," Marco confided during one of our meetings. "I know it sounds crazy, but it was there, Jamie. I know it was." Despite my initial skepticism, the evidence was mounting. One night as I lay in bed, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room. They were slow and deliberate, growing louder as they approached my door. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed. The footsteps stopped right outside my door, and then, nothing. The silence was deafening, and I felt a chill seep into my bones. I had to investigate. As I approached the doorknob began to turn. Half in terror and half in a desperate need to know, I yanked the door open. There was no one there. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I backed away slowly, my mind racing to rationalize what I just experienced. The spirit's presence was undeniable now. It was no longer just a series of coincidences. It was real, and it was with us. The name Elias echoed in my thoughts, a dark reminder of what we had unleashed. It wasn't long before we found out just how much danger we were in. A deep, pervasive chill settled into my bones following that night. It was as if the very air around us had changed, charged with an uncomfortable heaviness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Emily called us over again. Her eyes were tired, underscored with dark circles, and her normally vibrant demeanor had dulled. We gathered in her attic once more, unable to shake the compulsion to confront what we had released. "We need to find out what it wants," she said, her voice breaking. A sense of dread washed over me, but I concurred. We set up the board under the flickering light once more. "Spirit, what do you want from us?" Emily asked, almost pleading. The planchette moved immediately. "WARNINGBLOOOD WILLBESHED. Marco's face went pale. Emily trembled and clung to the table. "The full moon," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "It's tomorrow night." Desperation clawed at me. "We should stop. This is getting too real," I said, my voice cracking with fear. But it was too late. The next night, a full moon lit the sky, casting eerie shadows in Emily's attic. She couldn't sleep and kept hearing noises. Her younger brother, curious and unaware, had ventured into the attic. When morning came, he didn't. We found her brother's lifeless body in the attic, his eyes wide open but vacant, as though something had sucked the life out of him. There were no signs of struggle, no visible injuries. He simply ceased to be. The police arrived, flashing lights and curious neighbors, but they found no answers. The family was shattered, and Emily was inconsolable. We were haunted not just by the memories of what happened, but by our role in the horror unfolding around us. The once tight-knit bond among us began to fray. Emily withdrew, consumed by grief and guilt, while Marco became paranoid, convinced that something malevolent was following him. As for me, my once firm disbelief in the supernatural crumbled beneath the weight of the undeniable. Supernatural occurrences escalated. Objects in our homes moved on their own, doors slammed without reason, and cold spots materialized in otherwise warm rooms. Each night I heard whispers, soft, hissing voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. They repeated the same phrase, driving me to the brink of madness. REMMBERTHEPACT. One night, a particularly cold draft woke me from a restless sleep. As I sat up, I saw a figure standing in the corner of my room, shrouded in darkness. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum. I blinked, and the figure was gone. The air was thick with the same oppressive weight I had felt before. Marco, too, was suffering. He started missing classes, and his carefree demeanor vanished. When I visited him, his room was in disarray, and he looked gaunt and haunted. "It won't leave me alone," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I hear it calling my name at night. It's getting closer, Jamie. I don't know what to do." A cold knot twisted in my stomach. We were beyond simple explanations or rational solutions. There was a profound, terrifying truth we had to face, and it became undeniable the night Marco went missing. He had been in his dorm room. His roommate heard strange noises and called the campus police. They found the room empty, with claw marks on the walls, as though Marco had tried to resist being taken. Despair settled over me. Emily began experiencing horrific visions at night, shadowy figures reaching out to her, whispering threats and promises of doom. We couldn't run from it. We couldn't hide. Our only chance, I realized, was to confront the spirit and understand the pact. We were bound to it, and it was claiming what we had unknowingly promised, our souls. I had to find a way to break the hold it had on us before it was too late. With a sinking heart and a mind teetering on the edge of sanity, I prepared to face the malevolent force that had turned our lives into a living nightmare. One particularly cold night, I decided to dig deeper into the name Elias and the pact we had foolishly made. The town library became my refuge. Its dusty records and ancient books were a well of knowledge. Through hours of tireless research, I pieced together a harrowing story. Elias had been a malevolent spirit, summoned long ago by desperate townsfolk seeking to foretell their future. They made a pact with him, offering their souls for glimpses of what lay ahead. Elias kept his promises, but he twisted their fates in the darkest ways, claiming their lives one by one. My heart pounded as the truth sank in. We had repeated the mistakes of the past, bound to a spirit that thrived on fear and death. I had to warn Emily, but when I reached out, she didn't answer. I rushed to her house, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Emily's front door was ajar. The house was eerily silent as I made my way upstairs to her room. I found her sitting on her bed, eyes empty and fixed on the corner where a shadow loomed ominously. "Emily, snap out of it," I shouted, shaking her. She blinked, snapping back to reality, her eyes widening with terror. "It's here," she whispered. "It won't leave me alone." I grabbed her hand, desperation in my voice. "We have to end this, Emily. We need to confront it and break the pact." The room grew colder, and a low, guttural whisper filled the air. "REAMBERTEPACT." The shadow in the corner began to take shape, morphing into a visage that was both human and monstrous. It was Elias, the spirit we had summoned, now fully manifest and hungering for our souls. "Why do you haunt us?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" The spirit's eyes glowed with malevolent glee, and it answered in a voice that resonated with ancient evil. "Why? OURSOULS. I glanced at Emily, her face pale and filled with despair. But there was something else. Determination. Together we faced the entity, standing our ground. "We reject you," Emily said, her voice surprisingly strong. "We will not give in to your terror." A fierce wind swept through the room, and the spirit roared in anger. The temperature dropped further, and it felt as though the very air was being sucked out of the room. The shadows grew longer, pressing in on us from all sides. I held up the Ouija board, now our only connection to this nightmare. "You have no power here. The pact is broken." My voice echoed, and for a moment the spirit hesitated. The room seemed to hold its breath, and I could feel the tension in the air. With a final, defiant roar, the spirit lunged at us, but a blinding light burst forth from the Ouija board, enveloping the room. The spirit screamed, a sound that reverberated with centuries of anguish before it was pulled back into the board, which shattered into pieces. The oppressive weight lifted immediately, and the cold dissipated. Emily and I collapsed onto the floor, exhausted but relieved. The nightmare was finally over. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to normal. The haunting ceased, and the oppressive fear that had hung over us like a dark cloud was gone. Emily and I remained close, bound by the harrowing experience we had survived together. Marco's whereabouts remained a mystery, a somber reminder of the price we had paid. His loss weighed heavily on us, but we found solace in the fact that the spirit of Elias was no longer lurking in the shadows, waiting to claim our souls. In the end, we learned a valuable lesson. Some doors once opened cannot easily be closed. Our curiosity had unleashed a darkness we were ill-prepared to face, and it was only through sheer will and determination that we survived. Now, as I sit by the flickering fire and recount this tale, I hope it serves as a warning. Be careful what you seek, for the answers you find may not be worth the price you pay. Part 1 of the story. Last night, I held my wife Sarah in my arms. This morning, it's as if she never existed. My reality has changed, and I might be next. I woke up early, the morning light trickling through the bedroom window, casting a pale glow on the bed. My hand reached out instinctively for Sarah's side, but all I felt was cold, unwrinkled sheets. I blinked, my mind struggling to catch up with the gnawing pit of anxiety forming in my stomach. This wasn't right. Sarah had always been an early riser, but she never left the bed so pristine. Sarah? My voice cracked, raw with sleep and a sudden spike of fear. No response. The house was eerily silent. I threw off the covers and hurried through the house, calling her name again. The bathroom was empty, the kitchen was untouched, and the living room was devoid of life. Panic set in as I checked every room, every corner where she might be. Nothing. No sign. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Heart pounding, I dialed her number. The mechanical voice on the other end chilled me to the bone. This number is no longer in service. My hand started to shake. Dismissing it as some technical malfunction, I called my closest friend, Matt. "Hey Matt, it's Mark. Have you seen Sarah?" "Who?" Matt's voice was thick with confusion. "Sarah, my wife. We just had dinner with you last week." "Mark, are you okay? You've always lived alone." A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. "No, Matt. We've been married for 10 years. We had dinner just last week. She was there." There was a pause, then a click as Matt hung up, undoubtedly worried for my sanity. My heart raced as I called other friends, family members, anyone who might know Sarah. The responses were all the same. No one remembered her, as if she had evaporated from existence. The more I called, the more frantic I became, until finally, I stared at the phone in disbelief. How could she be erased from everyone's memory? Desperately, I tore through the house looking for any proof of Sarah's existence. Our wedding photo, gone. Her clothes, missing. Her books, her favorite coffee mug, even her hairbrush, all absent. It was as if she had never lived here at all. I slumped to the ground, head spinning, tears of frustration and fear welling up in my eyes. I knew I needed help, so I sought out Dr. Ellie Foster, a seasoned therapist. Her office was a comforting place, filled with warm colors and soft textures meant to put her patients at ease. The light filtering through the window made patterns on the floor as she watched me with kind, knowing eyes. "Tell me about Sarah," she said gently. "She's my wife. We've been married for 10 years. But now, it's like she never existed. No one remembers her, not even my friends or family." Dr. Foster nodded, scribbling notes. "And you have no physical proof of her existence?" "No. Everything's gone. She's gone." My voice cracked under the weight of my anguish. She leaned forward, her expression sympathetic but clinical. "Mark, it's possible you're experiencing a severe form of dissociation or a memory disorder. Sometimes our minds create memories." "No," I slammed my fist on the arm of the chair. "She's real. Our life was real. I am not making this up." She nodded again, though I could see the concern in her eyes. "Let's work through this together. If she was real, we'll find a way to get to the bottom of this." I wanted to believe her, but deep down, I could see her doubt. The session ended, and I left feeling no closer to an answer than when I arrived. That night, alone in my now seemingly alien house, I found an old leather-bound journal tucked away in a dusty corner of the attic. Skeptically, I opened it and began to read. My hands trembled as I turned the pages, each entry detailing intimate moments of a life with Sarah. But the handwriting wasn't mine. The entries were vivid, describing memories I clearly recalled, but they were signed. I froze as I reached the last page, where the final entry stood out. Dr. Nathan Hollis. I had no recollection of a Dr. Nathan. Hollis. Who was he? And why did he know so much about Sarah and me? From that point on, the journal became my lifeline to the truth I desperately sought, leading me to a potential ally in my unraveling world. Part 2 of the story. The journal entries consumed me, each one an invocation of my life with Sarah that I desperately needed to validate. And the elusive figure of Dr. Nathan Hollis hung in the air like an unspoken promise. If he had answers, I needed to find him. I checked the university campuses and public records, piecing together fragments of his existence. Each detail made him more real. Dr. Hollis was a historian specializing in anomalous events, his work buried under layers of academic obscurity. Eventually, I traced his office to a small, nondescript building on the outskirts of town. The place was a maze of books and papers, the smell of old parchment hanging in the air. Dr. Hollis himself was hunched over a desk, engrossed in some manuscript. It took several knocks for him to even notice me. When he did, his sharp blue eyes pierced through me. Dr. Hollis. My voice trembled. I'm Mark Thompson. I need your help. He eyed me warily but motioned for me to sit. What can I do for you? I showed him the journal. His eyes widened, a flash of recognition stirring within them. Where did you get this? It was in my attic. These entries, they're about my wife, Sarah. My breath caught. But she's gone, erased. No one remembers her but me and you. Dr. Hollis leaned back, his expression softening. You're not the first to come to me with a story like this. Sit down, Mark. Tell me everything. I recounted every detail while he listened intently, occasionally nodding. When I finished, he stared at a point in the distance, lost in thought. I've been studying these phenomena for decades, he began. People disappearing, memories being altered. I lost my daughter the same way 10 years ago. One day she was there, the next, gone, and everyone but me forgot she ever existed. His words struck a chord within me, a mixture of fear and hope rising. So there are others? Many, all with similar stories. I've been trying to find a pattern, some explanation for these anomalies. We spent hours discussing theories, from alternate dimensions to malevolent manipulations of reality. Despite our fervent discussions, the source of these disruptions remained elusive. It felt as though we were grasping at shadows in a pitch-dark room. Over the next few weeks, we combed through archives, dissected historical anomalies, and shared findings with others who had experienced similar losses. Each revelation brought us no closer to an answer, only deepening the mystery. My world became a labyrinth of uncertainties, each step echoing with a silent, sinister laughter. In the midst of this, the most disconcerting event occurred. I was in the kitchen one evening, trying to distract myself with the monotony of making dinner. Setting the table, I noticed that the same floral patterned plate moved from one hand to the other, as if it had never been on the table at all. I froze, the plate clattering to the floor. Objects around the house began shifting locations with disturbing frequency. A book I'd placed on the coffee table would later resurface in the bathroom. A glass of water on the nightstand would end up in the kitchen sink. Every glitch in my reality sent a shiver down my spine, leaving me in a constant state of anxiety. The worst moments were when conversations inexplicably changed mid-sentence. Dr. Hollis and I sat in a small cafe discussing our findings, his voice blending seamlessly from discussing a historical event to suddenly speaking of flowers in his garden without any logical transition. I stared at him in shock, which made him stop abruptly, his expression mirroring mine. Did you hear that? My voice was barely a whisper. His eyes widened with understanding. It happened again, didn't it? I nodded, my mouth dry. Reality itself seemed to be conspiring against us, reshaping our lives with each passing day. Dr. Hollis's presence was the only anchor in this ever-shifting storm. Late one night, as we pored over some old manuscripts, I happened upon a small note scribbled in the margin, a name that echoed like a ghost through time. Emily, lost but not forgotten. My heart pounded as I realized it had to be Dr. Hollis's daughter. Her existence acknowledged, even if just in these hidden margins. In our most desperate moment, we sought solace in each other's company, the old journal and our shared experiences binding us together. The pursuit of truth became our only refuge in a world gone awry, each discovery bringing us closer to an inevitable confrontation with the unknown forces at play. The air grew thicker with tension. In every reflection, every missed heartbeat, we sensed the invisible hand rewriting our lives. Our only choice was to wade deeper into the nightmare, hoping to unearth the dark architect behind these shifting realities. Part 3 of the story. The oddities of my warping reality kept mounting. One day I decided to revisit the local market, hoping the familiar surroundings might offer some semblance of normalcy or even an unexpected clue. The day was bustling, the market stalls overflowing with colors and sounds, a stark contrast to the silent void in my heart. As I wandered through the marketplace, my mind swirled with past and present, the old reality interweaving with the new. And then, in the midst of the cacophony, a flash of golden brown hair caught my eye. I turned, heart racing. Was it really her? My breath quickened as I began to weave through the crowd, calling out her name. Sarah! She glanced back, her eyes locking with mine for a fleeting moment. That recognition, it was unmistakable. I pushed harder through the throng, desperate to reach her. People jostled past, their faces blurred, and unimportant. My entire world narrowed to that one figure ahead of me. "Sarah, wait!" She turned down a narrow alley, and I followed without hesitation. But when I reached the end of the alley, she was gone. Panic set in as I scanned the small space, calling her name again and again. The alley was empty, just as our house had been that fateful morning. My steps faltered, my shoulders sinking in despair. Had I truly seen her, or was it another cruel twist of my fractured reality? The market's noise faded to a dull roar behind me, leaving me alone with my haunted thoughts. The realization that I might never find her, that she might forever remain an illusion, struck me like a physical blow. Returning home, the once lively house now felt like a mausoleum of forgotten dreams. I collapsed on the living room couch, staring at the spot where our wedding photo used to stand, feeling the weight of every lost moment pressing down on me. Sarah's laughter, her touch, her very essence, all snatched away by an unfathomable force. As the dim light of evening crept in, my mind wandered to the journal and the elusive Dr. Hollis's final note about his daughter, Emily. It resonated deeply with my own sorrow, the struggle to hold on to memories that reality itself sought to erase. Sitting there in the gathering shadows, a thought gnawed at me, dark and insidious. If reality could be rewritten so easily, what was stopping it from erasing me next? My pulse quickened as the walls around me distorted, the furniture seeming to melt and reshape before my eyes. Suddenly, a voice echoed from nowhere, slicing through the oppressive silence. "M-A-R-K-U-A-K-E-U-P. I sprang up, heart hammering. "Who's there?" The house answered with nothing but an echo. My vision swam, a dizziness overtaking me as I walked unsteadily to the mirror in the hallway. My reflection stared back, eyes wide with terror. For a heartbeat, it seemed to waver, morphing into a face that wasn't mine, then snapping back. I sank to my knees, gripping the edge of the dresser. This isn't real. This can't be real. But deep down, I knew it was more real than anything I had ever experienced. The journal, Sarah's disappearance, the haunting connection with Dr. Hollis, it all pointed to an unseen entity playing God with our lives. That night, I sat in silence, the room's shadows growing longer, encompassing the last vestiges of my sanity. As I gazed at where Sarah's picture once stood, a cold acceptance began to settle over me. I realized I was just another pawn, another name in the journal of twisted fate. I whispered to the empty room, "If you're going to take me, do it now. Erase me like you did with Sarah." But nothing came. Only the ticking of the clock marking the slow passage of time, the relentless march toward an uncertain end. I realized this was my new existence, a world where time could shift and my very being could be erased. In that moment, I understood the cold, chilling nature of my reality. "EXISTENCEISFLUID, I muttered to myself, the words almost a prayer. The house creaked and groaned as if in response, its skeleton shifting on invisible joints. Slowly I stood, feeling more alone than ever. One day I knew I might wake up as if I had never existed at all, just another ghost in the machine of a capricious universe. The past horror and present dread merged into a singular truth, one that I reluctantly accepted. Just as I had lost Sarah, the world could lose me. And whatever force was behind this would continue its dark work, reshaping lives and memories, leaving nothing but fading echoes of what once was.
I always thought moving to a new apartment was supposed to be exciting, but when I heard the slow, deliberate knocks at my front door at 3 a.m., I realized excitement was the last thing I felt. It started innocuously enough. In January, I found a cozy one-bedroom apartment in a quiet part of town, a perfect sanctuary to escape my hectic life as a night shift nurse. Sure, the place was bare and sterile, but it was mine. The first few weeks were uneventful. I'd come home exhausted at around 3 a.m., barely able to drag myself to bed. The apartment was dead silent, which I appreciated after the constant noise and chaos of the hospital. But then, one night in February, I was jolted awake by a sound that sent shivers down my spine. A slow, deliberate knock at the front door. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I thought maybe it was a neighbor in trouble, but the rhythm of the knocks felt deliberate, almost like a taunt. I tentatively made my way to the door. every creak of the floorboard amplifying my anxiety. Without a peephole to check, I stood frozen, barely breathing, my hand hovering above the doorknob. For what felt like an eternity, I waited, straining to hear any other sounds. When none came, I whispered to myself, maybe it's just a prank, and backed away. The next morning, exhausted but determined to make sense of it, I mentioned the knocking to my best friend Clara over the phone. She laughed it off, suggesting it was probably kids playing a prank or just my overactive imagination playing tricks due to fatigue. Clara's rationality usually grounded me, but I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling of unease. That night, the knocking returned. 3 slow taps, a pause, then 3 more. The same rhythm, the same taunting tone. Each knock seemed to echo within the walls of my apartment, reverberating through my bones. Again, I stood behind the door, heart thundering. I didn't sleep that night. By the 3rd night, I knew this was no hallucination. Something or someone was deliberately knocking on my door at 3 a.m. I couldn't bear the dread any longer, so I installed a peephole, hoping to catch a glimpse of my nocturnal visitor. Maybe then I'd have some answers. Maybe then I'd feel safe again. The following night, as the familiar knocks filled the silence once more, I cautiously approached the door and peeked through the peephole. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, standing in the dim hallway, was a tall figure wearing a hooded sweatshirt, obscuring his face. Motionless, he stood mere feet from my door, facing directly at it. My breath hitched, heart slamming against my ribcage. I must have made some noise because, all of a sudden, the figure tilted his head as if he'd heard something intriguing. I backed away from the door, the chilling realization sinking in. He knew I was there. He knew I was watching. The knocking stopped after what felt like an eternity, and I slumped against the wall, my mind racing. Who was he? What did he want? Why was he doing this? I'll admit, part of me hoped it was all just a bizarre coincidence. But as the days went on, little things around my apartment began to feel off. I'd come home to find objects slightly out of place, a book tilted on the shelf, a drawer partially opened. Once I caught a whiff of an unfamiliar scent, something metallic and sharp, like old pennies. Paranoia tightened its grip. I felt like I was losing my mind. Desperate to prove to myself that I wasn't, I set up a cheap security camera in the living room, aimed at the front door. The feed went straight to my phone, and I checked it obsessively during my shifts, hoping for some logical explanation. For a week, nothing happened. No knocks, no strange movements, no hooded figure. My heart began to relax into a false sense of security. Maybe it was truly over. Maybe it had all been some inexplicable prank or a byproduct of my stress-ridden mind. Then, one night, as I sat in the staff room scrolling through my phone during a break, I received an alert from the camera. Motion detected. My heart roared back to life. I fumbled to unlock the feed. There he was, standing right in front of my door, staring directly into the camera. This time his hood was down, but the angle and darkness concealed most of his face. His presence filled the screen, a living nightmare. Slowly, methodically, he reached up and covered the lens with something, plunging the feed into darkness. My hands shook as I dialed 911, barely able to articulate my words. When the police arrived, they found no sign of forced entry, no evidence of tampering. The officers seemed sympathetic, but suggested it might be a neighborhood kid playing a cruel joke. Their reassurances did little to ease my mind. Something deep and primal within me screamed that this was far from a prank. I searched online forums, desperate for similar stories or advice. That's when I stumbled upon a thread about copycat hauntings. People described experiences eerily similar to mine: persistent knocks, a sense of being watched, and a figure outside their home. Nobody had a clear explanation or solution. As the days turned into weeks, the frequency of the knocks dwindled, but my fear lingered. The quiet was almost worse, filling me with a sense of foreboding. Then one night, I came home to find a message waiting for me. Written in thick red letters on my living room wall, the word HELLO stared back at me, each letter dripping with what looked like blood. I nearly vomited. This was no prank. This was real, terrifyingly real. I knew, then and there, that I couldn't stay in that apartment a second longer. The days that followed were a blur of frantic packing and sleepless nights. I called Clara, panicked and breathless, explaining what had happened, She was at my door within the hour, her face a mix of concern and confusion. "Jessica, you've been under so much stress," she began, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. "Maybe we should talk to someone, a professional." "I don't need a shrink, Clara. I need to get out of here," I snapped, instantly regretting my tone. "I'm sorry. I can't stay here." Clara helped me find a new apartment on short notice, a small but cozy place on the other side of town. Moving day felt surreal, as if I were existing in a haze of fear and exhaustion. I half expected the hooded figure to show up and block my path, but nothing happened. The move went smoothly, almost too smoothly. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe the nightmare was behind me. 1 week after settling in, I felt a semblance of normalcy returning. I dared to hope that whatever had haunted me in the old apartment was gone for good. Maybe it was tied to that place, a curse on the building or something. Maybe I was finally free. But deep down, doubt gnawed at me. Then one night, as I returned home from another night shift, I froze on my doorstep. There, lying on the mat, was a single black rose. My hands trembled as I picked it up, a cold dread sweeping over me. I unlocked the door with shaking fingers, cautiously entering, my senses on high alert. I searched the apartment from top to bottom, but everything seemed untouched, just as I had left it. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe someone had dropped it there by mistake, but I couldn't dismiss the fear gnawing at my insides. The rational part of me clung desperately to the idea that this was all some elaborate prank. I decided to call Detective Harris. I hadn't told him about the move, but given the circumstances, I felt it was necessary. Detective Ryan Harris was a no-nonsense kind of guy, analytical and protective. When he arrived, he listened intently as I recounted everything: the knocks, the hooded figure, the message on the wall, and now the black rose. "Jessica, I believe you," he said, his green eyes studying my face, "but we need evidence." His words, though comforting, did little to quell the terror lurking in my heart. He didn't find any signs of forced entry or tampering either, but he offered to have the building under surveillance. I agreed, though I didn't hold much hope. Whoever was behind this seemed to know exactly how to avoid getting caught. Days passed without incident, but paranoia lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even as I performed mundane tasks around my new apartment. Every creak and shadow seemed menacing. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. Then, late one night at the hospital, I received another motion alert on my phone. My heart sank as I unlocked the feed, praying it was just another false alarm. But it wasn't. Once again, the hooded figure was standing right in front of my door, staring directly into the camera. This time, he reached up with a slow, deliberate motion and slipped something under my front door before disappearing into the darkness. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as I watched his shadowy form vanish from the screen. Det Harris arrived just as dawn broke. Together, we cautiously opened the door and found a small, old-fashioned key lying on the mat. No note, no explanation, just the key. The detective examined it carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This isn't just a prank," he muttered, mostly to himself. "I know," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. "But what does it mean?" "I'm not sure yet, but we'll find out." The discovery of the key did little to ease my mind. If anything, it heightened the tension, adding another layer to the disturbing mystery. Who was this hooded figure? Why was he targeting me? What did the key unlock? That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. I sat on the couch, staring at the door, clutching the key tightly in my hand. The hours dragged by, each tick of the clock echoing in the silence. As dawn approached, exhaustion finally overtook me, and I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke to the sound of slow, deliberate knocking. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more. My heart raced as I stumbled to the door, still groggy. I peered through the peephole, half expecting to be greeted by those familiar hooded shadows. But this time, Clara stood there, her face pale and worried. "Jessica, are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I heard about the key. I had to come." "Clara," I started, my voice breaking. "I'm just glad you're safe," Clara said, embracing me tightly. "We'll get through this, I promise." Her words offered a flicker of hope, but I knew that as long as the hooded figure remained a mystery, true peace was impossible. Clara's visit provided the temporary comfort I desperately needed, but as she left, a creeping sense of dread returned. I couldn't shake the feeling that the key held some dark significance, something that tethered me to the hooded figure. That evening, as I sat in my living room trying to make sense of it all, the lights flickered for a moment before plunging the room into darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my phone, using its weak flashlight to navigate the blackened apartment. I stumbled into the living room, the beam of light catching the reflection of something on the wall. With a jolt, I realized it was a message, crudely written in the same thick, red substance as before. Goodbye. I backed away, tripping over the coffee table and landing hard on the floor. My breath came in panicked gasps, my mind racing. Why now? What did it mean? My phone buzzed, nearly making me drop it. It was an alert from the security camera. Clutching the phone, I desperately unlocked the screen and opened the feed. There, in the darkness, stood the hooded figure. But this time, he wasn't alone. 2 more figures flanked him, all facing my door, silent and menacing. My blood ran cold. This was more than a haunting. It was a calculated terror. The camera feed went dark again, the lens covered by one of the intruders. I was paralyzed, wide-eyed and rooted to the spot, unable to peel my eyes away from the door. Moments later, the familiar knocking began. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more. Collecting all my courage, I crawled to the front door and carefully looked through the peephole. The same hooded figure stood closest, and as if sensing my presence, he slowly raised his hand, holding the key I'd received against the peephole. The outline of the old key was unmistakable. I couldn't take it anymore. I called Detective Harris, my voice a barely controlled whisper, begging him to come quickly. I huddled in the corner of the living room, waiting in the oppressive silence. It felt like hours before there was a knock at the door. This time, it was the rapid, confident knock of the police. I sprang to my feet and opened the door to find Detective Harris and 2 uniformed officers. I explained what had happened, my voice trembling with fear and urgency. The officers swept through the apartment and the building. They found no trace of the intruders or the messages. It was like they'd vanished into thin air. "I can't do this anymore," I said, my voice breaking. "They're toying with me." Detective Harris's eyes met mine, a newfound resolve in his gaze. "We'll get to the bottom of this, Jessica. But for now, I suggest staying somewhere else, someplace safe." I nodded, barely hearing him over the pulse of fear thrumming in my ears. I packed a bag, deciding to stay with Clara for a few days. It felt like the only place I could find some semblance of security. The next morning, as Clara brewed coffee, I heard her front door open and close softly. My stomach turned to ice. Clara and I exchanged a panicked look, realizing neither of us had moved. The hooded figure had followed me. Of course he had. We tiptoed to the living room, and there on the coffee table lay another black rose, next to a small, old-fashioned lock. I grabbed Clara's hand in terror, the key in my pocket growing unbearably heavy. I think it's for you to use the key," Clara whispered. I knew she was right. With trembling hands, I pulled the key out of my pocket and approached the lock. As I inserted the key and turned it, the lock clicked open and fell apart, revealing a folded piece of paper inside. My hands shook as I unfolded it, revealing a single sentence written in the same chilling red letters, IWILLFINDYOU. A scream lodged in my throat as the room spun. Clara held me tightly, whispering reassurances I could barely hear over the pounding of my heart. We called Detective Harris immediately. He arrived swiftly, taking the note and the lock as evidence, but his furrowed brow showed the same confusion and fear I felt. Days passed in a haze of sleepless nights and anxious days. Clara and I developed a system of checks and balances, never leaving each other alone, always checking the locks twice. Then, just as I began to think the nightmare was over, Clara's doorbell rang late one night. My heart sank as I went to check who it was, Clara following close behind. The door barely creaked open before we heard the slow, deliberate knocking. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more. I mustered the courage to open it fully, my breath hitching. There on the doorstep lay a red box tied with a black ribbon. With shaking hands, I undid the bow, lifting the lid to reveal an old-fashioned pocket watch, its glass case cracked. Clara and I stared at it, the tick-tock resonating in the dead silence. Then came the message, scratched inside the lid in small, deliberate letters, S-O-O-N. The tension in the air was suffocating, the finality of the message unmistakable. I knew then, in my bones, that the hooded figure was not done with me. The terror had followed me, burrowed into the folds of my life, and while I may never know his true purpose or identity, one thing was certain: he would always find me. When Emily moved into her new apartment to escape the ghosts of her past, she never imagined she'd be trading them for real specters that whispered her name in the dead of night. I tumbled into my new apartment, arms full of boxes, a combination of weariness and tentative hope swirling in my chest. After the chaos of a painful breakup, I needed a sanctuary, a place to heal and start anew. This one bedroom in an old, charming building seemed perfect. The quiet, tree-lined street below promised tranquility, a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil I'd left behind. The first few nights were uneventful. I busied myself with unpacking and tried to settle into a routine of normalcy. The creaks and groans of the building were easily attributed to its age, and I found a sort of comfort in the solid presence of the old walls and hardwood floors. It felt grounding. On the fourth night, as I was finishing up a late email for work, I heard it for the first time. A faint, incomprehensible whisper just on the edge of hearing. I paused, straining to catch a word or phrase, but it stopped. Just the pipes or the wind, I told myself, shaking it off. Deciding to unwind, I ran a hot bath. As the water filled the tub, the familiar hum of the running faucet drowned out my lingering anxiety. The warmth was a balm to my frayed nerves, and I closed my eyes, letting the tension melt away. My eyelids were growing heavy when I heard it again. The whispering, clearer this time, just outside the bathroom door. Heart pounding, I jumped out of the tub, grabbing a towel and wrapping it around me. I flung open the door. The hallway was empty. I stood there, shivering and dripping, every hair on my body standing on end. The whispering had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press against my ears. "Get a grip, it's just an old building," I muttered to myself, my voice sounding pathetically small in the quiet space. I decided to call it a night, telling myself I was just tired and stressed. But as I lay in bed, my thoughts refused to settle. Every creak of the floorboards and murmur of the wind felt magnified. Sleep came only in fitful, uneasy snatches. The next morning, bags under my eyes, I decided to ask my neighbor, Mrs. Haversham, about the building's history. She was an elderly lady who had lived there for decades. After a polite exchange, I broached the subject of unusual noises. "They're just old building sounds," she said, but there was a flicker of something, fear, in her cloudy blue eyes. "You'll get used to it." She quickly changed the subject, leaving me more unsettled than reassured. That evening, as I was about to take a shower, the whispering returned. This time, it was unmistakable. Soft, hushed tones that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Fear gnawed at my sanity, but I forced myself to continue with my routine, albeit with shaky hands. Determined to prove to myself that I wasn't losing it, I set up my laptop to record audio while I slept. The familiar chime of the recording starting was oddly reassuring. I settled into bed, feeling a mix of trepidation and exhaustion. The next morning, I hesitated before playing the recording. Did I really want to know? With a deep breath, I hit play. At first, there was nothing but the rustle of my sheets and the occasional toss and turn. Then, around 2:37 a.m., it started. The whispering, faint but unmistakable, and then chillingly clear. E-M-I-L-Y. My blood ran cold. The voice was unmistakably calling my name. Panic surged through me as I grabbed my phone and called my best friend, Janet. She listened patiently, though I could sense her skepticism through the phone. "Maybe it's just stress, Em. You've been through a lot," she said, trying to comfort me. "But why would I hear my own name?" I countered, my voice trembling. She suggested I visit her to get out of the apartment for a bit, but I felt a strange compulsion to stay, to understand what was happening. We agreed to meet for coffee the next day, and I spent the day in a daze, the recorded whisper looping in my mind. That night, despite my growing fear, I was determined to face whatever it was. I set up the recording again and lay in bed, heart pounding in my chest. It was around 3 a.m. when I heard it again. This time it was louder, as if someone was right next to my ear. Emily. I shot out of bed, grabbed my phone, and stood in the middle of the room, shaking. The whispering stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I could feel my heart thudding in my chest as I frantically scanned the room with my flashlight, but there was nothing. Just my empty apartment. The next morning, I felt more like a zombie than a person. Dark circles had etched themselves under my eyes, and my mind was racing with possibilities, none of them comforting. I had to know what was happening, so I decided to confront Mrs. Haversham again, more directly this time. I knocked on her door, and it took longer than before for her to answer. She seemed even more fragile and wary than the last time we spoke. "Mrs. Haversham," I began, my voice quivering slightly. "I have to know about the previous tenant. Did something happen here? I keep hearing things, whispers, calling my name." Her face paled, and she nervously twisted a handkerchief in her frail hands. "I don't know if I should be telling you this," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please," I urged, desperation bleeding into my tone. "I need to know." She sighed deeply, her shoulders slumping. "The young woman who lived here before you, she was found dead in the apartment. They never figured out how she died. There were no signs of a struggle. It was like she just stopped living." A chill ran down my spine. "Did she ever complain about hearing things?" Mrs. Haversham nodded slowly. "She mentioned whispers, just like you." I thanked her and stumbled back to my apartment, my mind whirling with fear and confusion. I immediately called Janet and arranged to meet her at a nearby cafe. Janet greeted me with a sympathetic hug, but I could see the worry etched in her features. "You look like hell, Em." I showed her the recording, and her face went pale. "Wow, that's eerie," she admitted. "But maybe it's some kind of interference? Old buildings have weird acoustics." Despite her attempts to rationalize it, I could tell she was disturbed. We discussed the situation over coffee, and she urged me to consider staying with her until I figured things out. That night, armed with Janet's supportive words but still haunted by fear, I set up my laptop to record again. This time, I was more proactive. I placed salt in every corner of the room, an old trick I'd read about that supposedly warded off spirits. It felt silly, but I was desperate. I lay in bed, eyes wide open, heart pounding. The whispering began around the same time, creeping into my ears like icy water. E-L-L-Y. I felt a cold breeze brush past my neck, and the hairs on my arm stood on end. I forced myself to remain still, gripping the edge of my blanket like a lifeline. E-M-L-Y. My breaths came in short, panicked bursts. An oppressive weight pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I couldn't move. It felt like invisible hands were wrapped around my throat, squeezing tighter by the second. In a burst of sheer terror and adrenaline, I broke free of the invisible grip and stumbled out of bed, gasping for air. I ran out of the apartment, not stopping until I was outside, heart hammering, tears streaming down my face. I called Janet from the sidewalk, my voice trembling. "Janet, I need to come over. I can't stay here." She didn't hesitate. "Come over, Em. We'll figure this out together." I grabbed the essentials, phone, wallet, keys, and fled to Janet's house, the building's front door slamming shut behind me. I thought I had escaped, leaving behind whatever haunted that apartment. But deep down, a part of me couldn't shake the fear that it wasn't over. That night, as I lay in Janet's guest room, I finally allowed myself to relax. Sleep came easier, but my dreams were restless. It was around 3 a.m. when I woke up, feeling like I was being watched. I held my breath, straining to listen. It was faint, just on the edge of hearing. E-M-I-L-Y. My heart dropped, and I felt the familiar cold grip of terror tightening around me. The whispers had followed me. The next day, Janet could tell something was wrong the moment I walked into the kitchen. "Em, did something happen last night?" I hesitated, then told her about the whispering. The way it had followed me here, invaded even this sanctuary. Her face went pale, and she set her coffee cup down with trembling hands. "We need to find a way to stop this," she said, determination in her eyes. "Maybe we should get help, like a priest or a medium." I agreed, though I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. That night, Janet and I prepared the house as best as we could. She laid out candles and prayed, while I simply wished for this torment to end. Exhaustion weighed heavy on me, and despite my fears, I eventually drifted off to sleep. It was around 3 a.m. when the air turned frigid and I felt a presence in the room. Paralysis gripped me, my body refusing to move even as terror clawed at my mind. The whispering began again, louder, more urgent. E-M-I-L-Y. I gasped for breath, feeling an invisible force pressing down on my chest. The air grew dense and suffocating, like being buried alive. Janet burst into the room, her face a mask of fear and resolve. She clutched a crucifix in one hand and a bundle of sage in the other. "Leave her alone," she screamed, waving the sage frantically. The pressure lifted slightly, enough for me to sit up and gulp in air. The whispering stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. Janet and I shared a look, a mixture of relief and terror. We knew this was far from over. For the next few days, we hardly slept. Janet did everything she could to protect me, laying salt lines and reciting prayers. But every night, the whispering returned, wearing us both down. One night, as we sat in the living room, Janet turned to me, her eyes red-rimmed and desperate. "We need to go back to your apartment, Em. Maybe we can find something there that will explain this, end this." Despite my fear, I knew she was right. We gathered our courage and headed back. The building loomed ominously as we approached, the windows like dark eyes watching our every move. My hands shook as I unlocked the door, but with Janet beside me, I felt a sliver of strength. Inside, the apartment felt colder, more foreboding than I remembered. We searched every corner, every hidden nook, looking for anything that might explain the malevolent presence. It was Janet who found the small, dusty box tucked away in a closet, filled with old letters and photographs. Among them was a journal, its pages yellowed with age. As we flipped through, a horrifying story emerged. The previous tenant had been haunted by the same whispers, driven mad by the relentless torment until she couldn't take it anymore. "This has to be it," Janet whispered, clutching the journal. "Maybe if we burn this, it'll end." We gathered the letters, photographs, and the journal, making a small fire in the fireplace. As the flames consumed the old papers, I felt a strange sensation, like a weight lifting, a breath of fresh air after being underwater for too long. That night, back at Janet's, I finally slept deeply, untroubled by whispers or shadows. When I woke, sunlight streamed through the windows, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt hope. Weeks passed without incident, and the horrors of those nights began to fade, becoming distant memories. Janet and I grew closer, bonded by the ordeal we'd faced together. But sometimes late at night, I'd find myself lying awake, straining to hear. And on those rare silent nights, when the world was dark and still, I'd catch the faintest whisper of my name. E-M-I-L-Y.
Tusher, Part 1, Shadows in the Dark. I've always been a light sleeper. The slightest sound, even a creak, can wake me up. So when Sarah and I moved into our new house, one of the things I looked forward to was the tranquil silence of our suburban street. Little did I know that silence would soon become deafening. It started subtly. One chilly November night around 3 a.m., I woke to a faint noise like a cat meowing. Annoyed, I shuffled to the window, expecting to find a stray. But the street was empty, eerily so. I dismissed it and crawled back into bed, convincing myself it was nothing. A few days later, the noises escalated, soft whispers that seemed to come from the walls. Sarah, ever the skeptic, brushed off my concerns. "It's an old house, Jack," she said. "It's just settling." One night, as the wind howled outside, I awoke again. A rhythmic tapping echoed through the darkness, coming from downstairs. My heart pounded. Each step I took down the staircase felt like a drum beat. With my lamp in hand, I approached the living room window. Then I saw him. In the flash of lightning, a silhouette stood eerily close to the glass. His face was almost pressed against it, eyes fixated on mine. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the lamp. "Sarah!" I called out, but my voice was barely a whisper. I dialed 911 with trembling hands. By the time the police arrived, the figure had disappeared. They found no footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing. Maybe it was a prank, the officer suggested. Somehow, that explanation brought no comfort. My sleep became scarce. Every night, the whispers grew louder, almost taunting. And then I saw him again. It was late, perhaps around midnight. This time, I felt his presence before I saw him. As I crept down the stairs, I saw him standing at the bottom, The lamp cast just enough light to reveal his unnervingly familiar stance. I had seen him before, pressed against the window. This time, his features were more defined, still shadow-clad, but undeniably real. WHATDOYOUDANT? I don't know how I managed to muster the courage to speak. The figure remained silent, the whispering around him growing louder, morphed into a chilling laugh that seemed to echo inside my very skull. A wave of primal fear washed over me. I stumbled back into the kitchen, where Sarah found me, shaking. Without a word, she dialed the police again. When they arrived, it was the same story, no evidence of anyone. The fear began to consume us, driving a wedge between Sarah and me. Each night was a descent into madness, sleepless and suffused with a sense of impending doom. I knew what I had seen. I knew he was real. But without proof, it was just my word against the silence of our so-called safe haven. One night, as a storm raged outside, I lay wide awake next to Sarah, who had finally started believing me after she also heard the whispers. It was only a matter of time before they returned. That night, something brushed against my arm, waking me instantly. I shot up, eyes darting around the room. Sarah lay beside me, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you feel that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. And then the whispering began again, louder this time, almost a chant. From downstairs, the rhythmic tapping resumed. Summoning every ounce of courage, I grabbed the lamp and motioned for Sarah to stay put. As I reached the staircase, the front door creaked open on its own. I peered down, my breath catching in my throat. At the bottom of the stairs stood the shadowy figure, taller and more defined than ever. He seemed to blend into the darkness, the whispers now deafening. He wasn't just a silhouette anymore, he was corporeal, menacing. "WHOAREYOU?" He didn't respond. The chilling laugh echoed once more, and then, as if mocking my fear, he melted into the shadows. Retreating quickly, I found myself back in the bedroom, Sarah clutching a knife, her eyes frantic. We stayed huddled there until dawn, fear and exhaustion gnawing at our sanity. We couldn't live like this, but we had no choice. The police, kind yet skeptical, couldn't protect us from what they couldn't see or understand. Days turned into weeks, each night blending into the next in a haze of terror and insomnia. Moving was the only option, but could we ever truly escape? The shadows at night and the dread of being watched haunt me to this day. Moving out didn't end our nightmare, it simply changed its form. Even now, whispers persist outside our window, a grim reminder that some horrors transcend understanding. Part 2, The Entity Unveiled. The night Sarah felt something brush against her was a pivotal point. For the first time, she believed every word I had said. We sat in the bedroom, listening to the whispers grow louder and more insistent. This was no figment of my imagination, it was real, and it was coming for us. A few nights later, we were in bed, trying to sleep despite the ever-present dread. Suddenly, a loud crash from the kitchen jolted us awake. Groggy and terrified, we rushed down the stairs. The kitchen was a mess, cupboards open, dishes shattered on the floor. An invisible force had torn through it like a tempest. "What the hell is happening?" Sarah whispered, eyes wide. As we stood there, the temperature dropped rapidly. My breath misted in front of me, and the whispers began anew, swirling around us. I felt something cold and unseen brush my cheek, sending a shiver down my spine. We backed away, clutching each other, terrified. The whispers coalesced into a single, chilling voice. "KNEELBEFOREME. Sarah screamed. I grabbed her hand and we bolted upstairs, slamming the door behind us. There, huddled together, we tried to comprehend what was happening. Rational explanations failed us. This was beyond our understanding. The next night was worse. We barricaded ourselves in our bedroom, hoping to keep the terror at bay. I had called Detective Barnes again, but his skepticism turned to genuine worry as he saw the state we were in. "Stay in tonight," he told me. "We're patrolling the area." It didn't matter. Around midnight, the voices returned, louder, more insistent. Objects in our bedroom started moving. First a picture frame, then a lamp. The whispers grew into a low chant, enveloping us in terror. Sarah and I clung to each other, eyes darting around the room. Then the door handle twisted and the door creaked open, as if inviting something in. SHOWYOURSELF. The air grew colder, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, and there he was, the shadowy figure, no longer just a silhouette but a fully formed entity. His eyes were dark pits, void of any humanity. "Este wafrmus," I shouted, my voice cracking. He stepped closer, his form darkening the already dim room. With every step he took, the whispers intensified, echoing around us like a sinister chorus. Sarah grabbed a flashlight and pointed it at the entity. For a moment, it recoiled, but not for long. It advanced again, faster this time. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed a nearby chair, smashing it against the doorframe to block its path. The entity dissipated into a shadow, leaving behind the same chilling laugh that had haunted my dreams. That was the breaking point. We couldn't endure another night in that house. The next morning we started packing, our movements frantic, driven by the need to escape. But even as we filed boxes into the car, I could feel eyes on me. Invisible hands seemed to tug at my clothes, my hair. Detective Barnes arrived, his face a mask of concern. "You're leaving?" he asked, but it was more of a statement. "We have to," Sarah replied, tears brimming in her eyes. "We can't stay here, not after what happened last night." He nodded solemnly. "I understand. Be safe and keep in touch. Let me know if anything else happens." As we drove away, the house loomed behind us like a dark cloud, haunting our rearview mirrors. I thought escape would bring relief, but deep down, I knew the shadows would follow us. This wasn't over. Even in our new apartment, the faint whispers remained, a constant hum in the background. Every night I felt the same dread, the same sense of being watched. The terror that started in that house had attached itself to us, inescapable and eternal. The shadows, the whispers, and the figure, they left us scarred. Each night as we lay in bed, the chilling realization hits us. The horror didn't stay behind. It traveled with us, a silent, unseen passenger, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again. Our Part 3. The haunting continues. Leaving the house behind felt like ripping apart the very fabric of our lives, but we had no choice. The moving van was stuffed with our belongings, the weight of each box a reminder of what we were running from. I hoped the whispers would fade with distance, but deep down, a sickening certainty told me they wouldn't. On our first night in the new apartment, I dared to hope. Sarah and I sat on our couch, the dim light of the lamp casting long shadows. We tried to find comfort in the new surroundings, but the silence felt too familiar. Around midnight, as we lay in bed, I heard it, a faint whisper. My heart sank. I closed my eyes, hoping it was just the wind, but it wasn't. Sarah's breathing hitched, and I knew she heard it too. The next few days were tense but uneventful. We tried to settle in, but the unease never left. One evening, our resolve to ignore the past shattered. We were unpacking boxes in the living room when the lights flickered. The hair on my arms stood on end. The temperature dropped, just like it had before. SARAHKNEELBEFOREME. The voice was unmistakable. It resonated through the room, chilling us to the bone. Sarah's face turned pale as we both realized we hadn't escaped. The entity had followed us. In the days that followed, we couldn't relax. Every corner seemed to harbor shadows. Every rustle held the promise of terror. Sarah became jumpy, her eyes darting towards the windows every few minutes as if expecting the silhouette to reappear. One night I woke to hear Sarah murmuring in her sleep. The whispers were back, louder and more insistent. I shook her awake, but her eyes remained clouded, lost in some terrifying dream. The temperature in the room plummeted. SHEISMINE, the voice filled the room, resonating within the very walls. I grabbed Sarah, trying to pull her out of her trance, but it felt as if some unseen force held her. The whispers grew, overlapping, creating a cacophony of dread. Breaking free from my paralyzing fear, I yanked Sarah towards the door. We stumbled out of the bedroom, the air around us vibrating with malevolence. As we reached the living room, the whispers followed, slithering through the atmosphere. Out of options and driven by sheer desperation, I called out into the darkness, "What do you want? Leave us alone!" The laughter echoed again, a cold, mocking sound. "We must leave," I whispered urgently to Sarah, who nodded in silent terror. We grabbed essentials, abandoning the apartment without a second thought, seeking refuge in a nearby motel. For a while, things seemed to calm down. We stayed in motels, friends' homes, anywhere but our haunted sanctuary. The whispers receded, and a fragile semblance of peace returned, but we couldn't keep running forever. We needed a permanent solution. Despite our fear, we returned to the apartment to pack our remaining belongings. As we crossed the threshold, the familiar chill met us. Shadows danced on the walls, seeming to mock our return. The whispers started, but this time they were different, clearer and more sinister. A tangible malice filled the air, wrapping around us like a suffocating blanket. We pushed through, hurriedly stuffing our belongings into boxes, every second stretching into an eternity. And then the final message arrived. IAMWATCHINGYOU. It was clearer, louder, and unmistakable. The realization hit us with force. This wasn't bound to a place. It had latched onto us. As we left that apartment for the last time, the weight of the whispers stayed with us. In our new, temporary living arrangement, even the slightest noise sent us into a silent panic. Every night, as we lay in bed, the shadows seemed darker, the silence more oppressive. Our lives have changed irrevocably. The whispers follow us. The feeling of being watched never truly fades. Whether it's a figment of our shared trauma or something more sinister, we may never know. But one thing is certain, we carry the haunting with us, a silent, eternal reminder that some shadows can't be escaped.
The first night in my new apartment, a loud, metallic banging woke me from a deep sleep, immediately putting me on high alert. Lying there, heart pounding, I tried to convince myself it was just the building settling or a neighbor moving around. I had just moved into this small studio apartment, and this was supposed to be a new beginning for me. After a long-term relationship ended, I needed a fresh start, and this place seemed perfect. Located in an old building with plenty of character, it was affordable and just a few blocks from work. But the longer I lay there, the more I felt a creeping unease I couldn't shake off. Morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows on the walls. I pushed myself out of bed and checked the apartment. Everything seemed normal. I made coffee, trying to dismiss the lingering sense of dread. It's just an old building, I told myself, rolling my eyes. For the next couple of nights, things were quiet. I spent my evenings watching Netflix, sketching designs, and chatting with my friends, Laura and Mike. They were thrilled about my new place, supportive of my steps toward independence. But then things started getting weird again. It was around midnight when I heard it, the unmistakable creak of a floorboard. I froze, gripping my book tightly. The sound came from the corner of the apartment where I had a small table and chairs. My heart raced, every beat echoing in my ears. I wanted to tell myself it was just the building again, but it felt different this time. It felt deliberate, like someone purposefully stepped there to make their presence known. For a few moments I did nothing, just sat there, listening, hoping not to hear anything more. When silence finally resumed, I bolted up and practically ran to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. The mere act of locking the door provided me little comfort. I spent the rest of the night tossing and turning, every creak and groan of the building amplified in the darkness. The following day, my exhaustion was evident. Laura, who met me for lunch, noticed immediately. "You look like you've seen a ghost. What's up?" she asked. I hesitated, unsure how to explain without sounding ridiculous. "It's nothing, just the apartment's old. It makes weird noises at night." Laura laughed. "Welcome to city living. You'll get used to it." Would I, though? That night, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I bought some cheap security cameras, hoping to catch whatever or whoever was making those noises. Maybe it would just be a creaky building and nothing more. Setting up the cameras gave me a bit of peace. Over the next week, I checked the footage every morning. Nothing. No signs of intrusion or movement apart from my own. I began to feel a little more at ease, thinking maybe Laura was right after all. Maybe I just needed to adjust. But that sense of security didn't last. One night, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it again, the same floorboard creaking. This time, I bolted out of bed, heart racing, and checked the feed from the cameras on my laptop. Nothing. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, willing the footage to reveal something, anything. But it was just me, alone, in my tiny apartment. 2 more weeks went by without incident. Then I found it, the clue that shattered my fragile peace. I was reviewing footage from the night before when a brief flash of movement caught my eye. I rewound and played it back, frame by frame. There, just barely visible at the edge of the frame, was what appeared to be a face, peering into my bedroom. My heart stopped. I couldn't make out any details, but the eyes were unmistakable, wide, dark, and staring right at me. I couldn't breathe. My hands trembling, I rewound the footage again and again, hoping it was a trick of the light or a glitch in the camera. But each time, the face was there, hauntingly clear for just a moment, eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on me. I sat there, paralyzed by fear, until the sun began to rise, casting weak light through the blinds. I called the police, barely able to keep my voice steady as I explained what I'd found. They arrived later that afternoon, 2 officers who moved efficiently through my small apartment. They watched the footage and performed a thorough search, but found no sign of forced entry, no fingerprints that didn't belong to me. One of the officers, a woman named Officer Garcia, tried to reassure me. "Sometimes these cameras can play tricks on you," she said gently. "Reflections, shadows, they can look like shapes or faces. It's probably nothing. But if you feel unsafe, maybe think about staying with a friend for a while." I nodded numbly, not fully convinced. Laura and Mike both insisted I come stay with them, but I couldn't shake the stubborn need to confront this alone. This was my new beginning, my proof that I could handle life on my own. The paranoia, though, began to eat away at me. Every night was a battle, trying to sleep while hyper-aware of every sound. I started locking every door and window obsessively, checking the footage multiple times a day. My apartment, once a symbol of my newfound freedom, had become a prison of constant fear. One particularly sleepless night, I woke up to a new nightmare. My heart pounded as I glanced at my laptop, eager to see if there was any new clue. I scrolled through the footage, frame by frame, feeling my stomach tighten in knots, and then I saw it, the vague outline of a figure standing just outside the door to my bedroom. I screamed and bolted out of bed, the echo of my own voice bouncing off the walls. Enough was enough. I picked up my phone and called Mike, my hands shaking so badly I could hardly type his number. "M-I-K-E, I whispered, forcing the letters out one by one. "Sam? What's wrong?" he answered groggily. "He's here. Someone's in my apartment. I saw him on the footage," I replied, my voice trembling. "Stay put. I'm on my way," he said, hanging up abruptly. Within minutes, Mike was at my door, his presence a brief balm to my frazzled nerves. He had brought a small toolbox with him, insisting on thoroughly checking every possible entry point. We stayed up all night discussing whether it was worth calling the police again. The following morning, I decided to install additional locks and even placed a baseball bat under my bed, desperate for any form of protection. Despite Mike and Laura's continued support, I felt dangerously close to the edge, teetering between reality and the grips of a nightmare. The next night, determined to catch this intruder, I stayed awake, watching the live feed from the cameras. Hours passed, my eyes growing heavy, but I fought against sleep. Just when I thought I'd drift off, I saw it, the figure moving stealthily through my living room, heading towards my bedroom door. My pulse skyrocketed. "Theres, someone here," I choked out in a hushed voice, panic seizing my chest. I watched in horror as the door's handle began to turn slowly. Summoning every bit of courage, I grabbed the bat from under my bed, ready to confront whatever nightmare awaited me. But before I could make a move, the door stopped, the figure retreating into the shadows. Every ounce of bravery drained from my body as the gravity of my situation truly hit me. This wasn't some hallucination or faulty equipment. Someone was inside my home. I felt a chilling realization wash over me. I was being hunted, and the predator was getting closer. That's when I decided I needed to get out, to escape this relentless torment. But just as I was planning my exit, something on the kitchen table caught my eye. My blood ran cold as I slowly walked over, the room spinning around me. It was a note, hastily written, its message clear and horrifying. I, LKWATCHINGYUUSLEEP. I stared at the note, my hands trembling as the words seemed to blur and swim in front of me. I take EATTHINGYLEEP. The room closed in around me, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I grabbed my phone and dialed Laura's number, desperation cutting through my voice. Laura, I managed to whisper, fighting to stay calm. Sam, what's wrong? She answered, instantly alert. Teach ERESANOTE, SOMEONEINSIDE, I stammered, my voice barely coherent. I'm coming to get you. Pack your things. Now. Laura's urgency propelled me into action, and I hurriedly threw essentials into a bag, my heart a relentless drum in my chest. Every creak and groan of the apartment seemed amplified, each one making me jump, but I kept packing, fueled by sheer terror. Laura arrived faster than I thought possible, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and determination. She practically dragged me out of the apartment and into her car. As we sped away, I kept glancing back at the building, half expecting to see a shadowy figure in the windows, watching us leave. You're staying with me, Laura insisted as we reached her place. We'll sort everything out in the morning. Exhaustion finally claimed me, and I fell into a fitful sleep on Laura's couch. I woke up several times throughout the night, my dreams plagued by dark, staring eyes and the eerie creak of floorboards. The next day, Mike joined us, and we discussed our options. I was too shaken to return to my apartment, and even the thought of it filled me with dread. Together, we decided to file another police report and request additional patrols around the building. Mike offered to help me break my lease and find a new place. Packed close between Laura and Mike, I felt a sliver of safety returning, but the fear lingered. The traumatic events had etched themselves deeply into my mind, and I was haunted by the relentless sense of being watched. A few days later, I returned to the apartment with Mike to gather the rest of my things. Every step inside felt like walking through a ghostly replay of my own fear. As we cleared out the last of my belongings, I glanced around one final time, hoping to leave the terror behind. But as we stepped out, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. An envelope slipped under the front door. I picked it up, my hands trembling as I opened it. The same chilling handwriting stared back at me, the words stark against the paper, IWILLWAYSFINDYOU. Mike saw the note and quickly ushered me out, but the damage was done. The words echoed in my mind, a horrifying promise that left me questioning the reality of my safety. I moved in with Laura permanently, and although I tried to regain a sense of normalcy, the lingering paranoia never truly went away. Every shadow seemed darker, every sound more sinister. The nightmares persisted, always filled with dark, staring eyes. Even now, as I write this from Laura's guest room, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. The sense of someone's eyes following my every move haunts me day and night. I double-check locks and windows obsessively, but the fear remains. I stare out the window, expecting to see someone, staring back. Though I've left the apartment behind, the terror has followed me, embedding itself into the fabric of my existence. That note, that chilling promise, replays in my mind. IWILWYSFISFYOU.